A soft wind rustles across the northern sea, brushing gently over long-forgotten shores. The waves are calm now, though once they carried the creaking hulls of dragon-headed ships across great distances. In this stillness, the world of the Vikings begins to unfold, not with the clash of swords or the roar of battles, but with quieter truths that linger just beneath the surface of legend. To drift into their story is to step into a world of rugged coastlines, flickering hearths, and starlit skies, where life was shaped as much by silence as by sound. Despite their fierce reputation, the Vikings were not a single tribe or nation. The word Viking itself is not a name for a people, but rather a word that described an activity. To go a Viking meant to embark on a sea expedition, often for trade, exploration, or sometimes raiding. The people we call Vikings were mostly Norse, hailing from what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. But they didn't see themselves as part of a single group. They were farmers and blacksmiths, explorers and storytellers, parents and poets. The age of the Vikings, spanning roughly from the late 700s to the early 1100s, was a time of both violence and beauty, of mystery and marvel, often misunderstood and reduced to a narrow view of horned helmets and pillaged villages. And speaking of horned helmets, it's one of the most persistent myths. No historical evidence suggests that Viking warriors ever wore helmets adorned with horns. This image was popularized in the 19th century, especially through opera and stage costumes. In truth, Viking helmets were practical and often simple, made of iron or leather. Many warriors may not have worn helmets at all, as metal was expensive and reserved for the wealthier few. The reality is less theatrical, but perhaps more interesting. A reminder that history is often far quieter and more nuanced than the stories we grow up with. Viking society was remarkably complex. Their world was governed not just by kings or chieftains, but by assemblies known as things. These were gatherings where free men could debate laws, settle disputes, and make decisions for the community. In a time when many parts of Europe were ruled by rigid hierarchies, the Norse approach to law and consensus stood out. The Icelandic Althing, founded around the year 930, is often considered the oldest surviving parliament in the world. Meetings were held outdoors, with people gathering under the open sky to speak, listen, and decide. It paints a different picture of the Viking world, one that values dialogue and shared decision-making. Their ships, too, were more than vessels of war. Longships were technological masterpieces, sleek, fast, and flexible. They could navigate the open sea and also travel along narrow rivers, allowing Norse voyagers to reach far beyond their homelands. These ships made it possible for the Vikings to settle in places as distant as Newfoundland in North America, centuries before Columbus was born. In 1960, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lancel Meadows in Newfoundland, offering solid evidence that Viking explorers had crossed the Atlantic around the year 1000. It's a quiet yet astonishing truth, tucked away at the edge of a continent. Equally fascinating is the role of women in Viking society. While they lived within a patriarchal culture, Norse women held more rights than many of their European counterparts. They could own property, initiate divorce, and in some cases, lead households or even wield power as seeresses or landowners. The sagas mention women who commanded ships, ran businesses, and fought in battles. The historical record is less definitive on the existence of female warriors, but recent archaeological finds have added new layers to the conversation. One of the most debated discoveries is the burial of a warrior in Birka, Sweden, long thought to be male, but DNA analysis revealed the skeleton was biologically female. She was buried with weapons and game pieces, suggesting a person of strategic knowledge and high status. Whether this represents a rare exception or a broader pattern remains uncertain, but it invites quiet wonder about the roles women may have played. Even the term raiders oversimplifies Viking activity. Many expeditions were for trade and settlement, not conquest. Viking merchants traveled as far as the Middle East, their goods carried along the rivers of Eastern Europe into the bustling markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. Norsemen served as bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor in the elite Varangian Guard, their loyalty and size earning them a fearsome reputation. Yet these same travelers brought back silks, spices and stories, signs of a people deeply connected to a broader world. Their runestones tell tales of those who went east and never returned, or who came back with riches and memories. These stones, often raised in memory of the dead, are not just markers of loss but quiet letters to time, carefully carved messages from one age to the next. As the northern sky stretches above their lands, it becomes clear that the Vikings were not only warriors, they were farmers, carving out a living from difficult soil. They were sailors, tracing ancient sea paths with skill and bravery. They were believers in fate and the unseen, their myths full of gods who walked among them and worlds that danced on the edge of destruction and rebirth. Their lives were deeply entwined with nature, the turning of seasons, the whisper of fjords, the long twilight of northern summer. And so we begin, not with the noise of conquest, but with a gentle unraveling of their world, the surprising facts that lie beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed like sea glass on a quiet shore. Beneath the soft moss and rolling hills of Scandinavia lies a world gently shaped by centuries of quiet persistence. The soil tells its own story, not just of battles or ships, but of everyday life. The Vikings were, first and foremost, agricultural people. For all their travels, most Norse folk spent their lives not aboard ships, but on farms nestled in valleys or beside cold, clear lakes. Their connection to the land was deep and enduring, rooted in rhythms that followed the arc of the sun and the subtle passage of seasons. The Viking farm was a world of its own. Longhouses, which served as the central structure of most farms, were long and low buildings constructed from wood, turf or stone, depending on the region. Inside, life was close and communal. The hearth was the heart of the home, its fire burning steadily through the long winters, casting flickering shadows on walls made of timber and sod. Families gathered here to eat, to talk, to mend clothing and prepare food. The smell of smoke, wool and drying herbs would have filled the air, while outside, sheep grazed and dogs kept watch. Chickens clucked in the yard, and beyond them, fields of barley and rye waved gently in the breeze. These were not the scenes of invaders, but of settlers, of people who loved the quiet dependability of land and labor. One of the more surprising aspects of Viking life was their attention to grooming and appearance. Far from being wild or unkempt, Norse people valued cleanliness and presentation. Archaeologists have uncovered an array of personal grooming tools in Viking burials: combs made from antler, tweezers, razors, and ear picks. Combs, in particular, were so common that nearly every grave, regardless of gender or wealth, seems to include one. The Vikings even had regular bath days, usually Saturday, which became known in Old Norse as laffadagar, meaning washing day. In contrast to their European contemporaries, who often viewed bathing with suspicion, the Vikings were considered unusually clean. English chroniclers even complained that Viking men were so well-groomed and fashionable that they frequently attracted local women, causing friction between cultures. Their diet, too, was more varied and nutritious than many imagine. Viking meals typically included bread made from barley or rye, soups and stews rich with vegetables like leeks and cabbage, and preserved fish or meat. Dairy products such as cheese, butter, and fermented milk were common, and honey was used both for sweetening and for brewing mead. a drink that held ritual and social importance. In colder months, they smoked or dried their food, storing it carefully to last the winter. Hunting and fishing supplemented their supplies, and in more fertile regions, orchards yielded apples and berries. Their knowledge of food preservation and seasonal balance reveals a practical wisdom, the kind that grows from years of watching the sky and listening to the land. Beyond sustenance, the Vikings nurtured a rich cultural life, woven through with song, poetry, and oral storytelling. Their stories were passed down through generations in the form of sagas, long, complex narratives that blended history with myth. These sagas were often recited aloud during winter nights, their cadences filling the dimly lit halls while the wind whispered outside. Some tales were of gods and monsters like Odin, who traded an eye for wisdom, or Thor, whose hammer shook the heavens. Others recounted the deeds of real families, layered with memory and embellishment. In the absence of written literature for much of the Viking Age, these stories were not just entertainment but memory itself, a living archive preserved in speech and song. And then there were the runes, mysterious, angular characters carved into wood, stone and bone. The runic alphabet, known as the Futhark, was used for a wide range of purposes, from marking ownership to casting spells. Runes were believed to hold power, not merely as letters, but as symbols infused with meaning. A single rune might offer protection, bind a spirit, or bless a journey. On runestones and amulets, these inscriptions whisper across the centuries, quiet echoes of hopes and warnings, names and prayers. There is something deeply human in these fragments, the desire to leave a trace, to be remembered. Viking spirituality was itself a layered and complex world. They believed in a cosmos made up of 9 realms, connected by the great tree Yggdrasil. Their gods were not distant or all-powerful, but flawed, shifting and deeply woven into human experience. Odin, the god of wisdom and war, was revered for his sacrifices and endless search for knowledge. Freyja, goddess of love and sorcery, walked the boundary between life and death. And Loki, the trickster, stirred chaos with a sly smile. Norse religion was intimate, a system of belief rooted in everyday life, in rituals performed at home or in sacred groves rather than vast temples. Offerings of food, drink and small carved idols created a sense of connection to the unseen. There was no single sacred book, no formal priesthood, just a lived spirituality, one shaped by environment, ancestry and experience. In this world of breath and stone, song and soil, even the harshest elements held meaning. Snow was not just an obstacle, but a reminder of endurance. The sea was not only dangerous, but full of promise. The Vikings saw their lives as part of a great cycle, a tapestry of fate, known as word, spun by unseen hands. They embraced both the joy and the struggle of life, with a sense of acceptance that feels strangely calming. Their bravery was not just about battle, but about living fully in the face of uncertainty, cultivating land where little would grow, setting sail into the unknown, or singing old songs into the wind. And so as the fire in the longhouse crackles low, and the stars reappear above the fjords, we begin to see the Viking world for what it truly was, not just fierce and wild but thoughtful and human. A place where each carved rune, each woven thread, and each spoken tale formed a bond between past and present, between people and place, gently enduring through the long northern night. The sea was never silent, not truly, always a hush, a ripple, a whisper just beneath the surface. For the Vikings, it was a path, a companion, a presence both feared and revered. They knew the waters intimately, not only the open ocean, but the secret veins of rivers and fjords, the winding channels that threaded through Europe and beyond. Their longships, with slender keels and shallow drafts, allowed them to glide into unexpected places no one thought reachable. In this way, the Vikings left quiet traces far from their northern homelands, not as mere conquerors, but as travelers, listeners, and settlers in distant lands. One of the most extraordinary yet often overlooked truths is just how far the Norse world extended. In what is now modern-day Russia and Ukraine, Viking traders known as the Varangians traveled deep inland along rivers like the Dnieper and the Volga. These waterways connected the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas, leading them to the gates of Constantinople, known to them as Miklagard, the Great City. Here, under the gilded domes of Byzantium, Norse warriors served as elite guards to the emperor, their loyalty prized for its foreignness, their axes a symbol of prestige. The Varangian Guard became a place of honor for these men of the north, a paradoxical role, the feared raiders of Western Europe, now entrusted to protect the heart of the Eastern Empire. But their reach went even farther. On the island of Sicily, Viking mercenaries fought alongside Norman princes. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate recorded the presence of Rus traders, Norsemen by origin, selling furs, swords, and amber from the northern forests. They wore silver arm rings as currency, spoke in multiple tongues, and adopted customs as easily as they shared their own. They were adapters, curious observers of the world around them. In some places they stayed, assimilating into local populations. In others, they vanished like mist, leaving only fragments behind, a burial mound here, a piece of jewelry there, a rune carved hastily into a stone. Perhaps one of the most quietly astonishing chapters is the Norse exploration of the North Atlantic. From the windswept coasts of Norway, settlers reached the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, then Greenland, a name more hopeful than accurate. There they built turf-roofed houses and raised sheep on thin, rocky soil. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, led the first major Greenland settlement, promoting the new land with names that concealed its harshness. His son Leif Erikson would go even farther, sailing west and reaching the edges of North America around the year 1000. They called it Vinland, possibly named for the wild grapes or meadows they encountered there. The sagas speak of encounters with indigenous peoples, of conflicts and trade, of attempts at settlement that ultimately faded. Yet for a brief moment in time, Norse footsteps touched the shores of a continent long before it would be officially discovered. It is a quiet marvel, one often overlooked, yet deeply significant, a whisper from 1,000 years ago. Back in their own lands, the Vikings were keen observers of the natural world. They used the sun, stars, and landmarks to navigate with surprising accuracy. While they did not have compasses, as we know them today, some evidence suggests they may have used sunstones, naturally occurring crystals like calcite, to locate the position of the sun on cloudy days, polarizing the light to find direction. This ability to read the world around them, to feel its subtle cues and signs, was as much intuition as science, a knowledge passed down through practice and careful watching. To sail without maps or instruments, relying only on memory and experience, was a profound act of trust in both the environment and one's own senses. And with them, they carried not only tools and weapons, but traditions and stories. Their art, often understated but full of meaning, was carved into wood, woven into cloth, and etched into bone. Viking art often followed interlacing patterns, with animals winding around one another in eternal loops. These designs weren't purely decorative, they reflected a worldview that saw life as interconnected, cyclical, and sacred. Even grave goods followed this philosophy. Burials were personalized and symbolic, with items chosen not just for their value, but for their meaning. A blacksmith might be buried with his tools, a child with toys or small ornaments. A woman with keys, beads, or weaving equipment, the symbols of her role in home and community. Some were buried in ships, massive vessels placed upon land, surrounded by offerings, their keels pointed toward eternity. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, discovered in 1904, revealed two women laid to rest in an elaborately decorated ship, accompanied by fine textiles, carved sleighs, and wooden chests. The richness of the burial raised questions still unanswered. Were these women nobles, priestesses, queens? The craftsmanship of their tombs speaks of high status, but the silence of history leaves room for imagination. What remains is a sense of reverence, not only for the dead, but for the journey beyond. In this culture of voyaging, death was not an end but a passage. The Norse believed that the soul might travel to different realms, depending on how one lived or died. Warriors hoped for Valhalla, a hall of the slain presided over by Odin, where they would feast and fight forever. Others might go to Folkvangra, Freyja's field of the fallen, or to Hell, a quiet and shadowed place, not a place of punishment, but of rest. These beliefs shaped not only how they lived, but how they faced death, with a kind of calm acceptance, a recognition that all things flowed toward a greater unknown. And as the sails unfurl again in our minds, catching the soft wind of centuries past, we begin to feel the gentle tug of that Viking spirit, not one of violence, but of wonder. A restless urge to see what lies just beyond the horizon. A quiet confidence in the strength of memory, myth, and the sea. Even now, as the world around us slows and night deepens, their journeys continue, not in the roar of conquest, but in the ripple of a story told softly, again and again. Imagine the soft glow of firelight spilling from the open doorway of a longhouse. The scent of roasting meat mingles with the faint sweetness of mead and the earthy aroma of peat smoke. Inside, voices rise and fall like waves, not in shouts or clamor, but in rhythmic speech, in the soothing cadence of shared stories and sacred songs. Feasting in Viking culture was not merely about food or celebration. It was ritual, remembrance, and a gathering of meanings that reached beyond the visible world. These moments, long past, still whisper quietly through the archaeological remnants, through carved drinking horns, cracked game pieces, and traces of long-extinguished fires. Viking feasts were central to their social and spiritual lives. They marked the changing seasons, celebrated victories or harvests, and honored gods and ancestors alike. The blot, a sacred feast held in honor of the gods, involved offerings of animals, usually pigs, horses, or cattle, and shared meals that reinforced both communal bonds and cosmic order. Blood from the offerings was believed to hold spiritual power, sprinkled on statues of deities, carved wooden pillars, and even the attendees themselves. This was not seen as gruesome, but as deeply meaningful, a symbolic act that connected the human world to the divine. These gatherings could last for days, filled with music, poetry, and the ritual drinking of toasts. Each toast carried intention to the gods, to the ancestors, to the king, and to personal fortunes. Mead and ale flowed in generous quantities, passed around in ornately carved vessels. Skalds, Viking poets, played an important role during these feasts, reciting tales of heroism, divine deeds, and distant travels. Their verses were not simply entertainment, but a form of cultural memory. A skald's well-crafted line could preserve a family's honor or enshrine a fallen warrior's name for generations. And yet, not every tale told by firelight was meant for glory. Some were whispered cautionary stories of trolls in the forest or spirits in the fog. Norse folklore was rich with creatures that existed in the liminal spaces between worlds. There were the Huldafolk, or hidden people, who lived in rocks and hills and were said to bring blessings or misfortune depending on how they were treated. There were Droga, undead beings who haunted burial mounds, guarding treasure or seeking revenge. These stories reveal a worldview where the veil between worlds was thin and respect for the unseen was woven into everyday life. Vikings also practiced forms of magic and divination, particularly Seidr, a mystical tradition often associated with women and with the goddess Freyja. Practitioners of Seidr could see into the future, speak with spirits, or influence events through ritual and incantation. One of the most fascinating aspects of this practice is that it was often performed by Vole, female seers, who traveled from village to village, sometimes accompanied by ritual staffs and animal skins. These women held a liminal role in society, both revered and feared. Their trance-like states, achieved through chanting and rhythmic movements, opened the door to hidden knowledge. In a world where fate was believed to be woven by the Norns, the Norse equivalents of the Fates, the ability to glimpse the threads was both sacred and unsettling. And still, even in such a richly spiritual world, the Vikings were deeply practical. They understood weather patterns, animal behavior, and the cycles of growth and decay. Their calendar was divided into only 2 seasons, summer and winter. They marked time with manafla, or legal assemblies, and with recurring festivals such as Yule, which celebrated the winter solstice with fire, feasting, and gift-giving. Traditions that would later echo through the customs of Christmas. They honored their dead, not only in grave mounds and runestones, but through stories told, land tended, and names passed on with quiet pride. Archaeology has continued to uncover subtle glimpses into these everyday rituals. In ancient wells we find purposefully deposited offerings, tools, beads, and bones, suggesting reverence for water spirits or local deities. In some settlements, carved figurines of gods or ancestors are found placed in doorways or under floors, a quiet invocation of protection. Even in the layout of farms and homes, there is a pattern, a logic of space that reflects both function and belief. Hearths face certain directions, thresholds are marked with runes, and gathering spaces are arranged with care. Every detail, even the humblest, seems touched by a sense of intention, and in the colder regions of the Norse world, where winter nights could stretch on endlessly, light itself became sacred. Candles, torches, and fire were not merely sources of warmth, they were symbols of endurance, flickering defiantly against the dark. In many ways, the Viking worldview was one of balance between light and shadow, strength and stillness, fate and choice. Their rituals, whether bold or simple, were ways of maintaining that balance. A toast, a tale, a stone laid with care, each became a thread in the fabric of their living world. As we linger beside that longhouse fire, the echoes of their rituals still seem to hum softly around us. The rhythm of the drum, the murmur of voices, the gentle clink of horn against wood. Not a world of chaos, but one of deeply held patterns, where meaning was found not just in battles and voyages, but in the repetition of ancient gestures. In the offering placed at the foot of a tree, in the hush before a toast. In the quiet awe of watching the northern lights dance across the night sky. There is something deeply soothing about the rhythm of weaving, the gentle thump of the loom, the steady pull of woolen thread through a wooden shuttle. In the Viking world, weaving was more than labor. It was tradition, economy, and even a kind of sacred act. Nearly every Norse household included a loom, and textile work was primarily overseen by women, whose role in preserving knowledge, creating clothing and sustaining households was central to daily life. The long winters and rugged climates required clothing that was not only warm but durable. Cloaks, tunics, mittens, and socks, all crafted by hand, from wool spun on drop spindles to cloth dyed with natural colors from plants and lichens. Wool was the most common textile fiber, but linen, made from flax, was also used when available. The Norse knew how to card, spin, weave, and dye, and their garments often featured beautiful detailing, braids, brooches, and woven trims. Viking women wore dresses with shoulder straps, held by decorative oval brooches, from which hung tools, amulets, and keys, both practical and symbolic items. Men's clothing was layered and functional, tunics over trousers, cloaks fastened with pins and belts that held pouches, knives, and other essentials. Shoes were made from soft leather, stitched by hand, and shaped for the journey across uneven ground. But clothing held deeper meanings too. It marked status, profession, and identity. A well-decorated cloak might reflect a person's success in trade or their place in a noble household. Brightly colored garments signified wealth, as dyes such as red and blue were expensive and time-consuming to produce. Jewelry, often made of bronze, silver, or glass, added further clues to a person's role in society. Arm rings, necklaces, and pendants were not just adornments, but statements of allegiance, family ties, or even personal protection. Small Thor's hammer amulets, called Mjolnir, were especially common, worn as symbols of faith or cultural pride, particularly during the years when Christianity began to spread across the Norse world. Viking families were tightly bound, not only by blood, but by carefully tended social connections. Kinship extended beyond immediate relatives and played a central role in one's responsibilities and protections. If a member of your family was wronged, you were expected to seek justice. If you were accused, your kin would defend you in the thing, the legal assembly where disputes were resolved. Reputation was essential, and honor was often measured by how one protected and supported their kin. This network of family, fosterage, and oath-bound friendship shaped much of Viking life, creating layers of connection that offered both support and obligation. Marriage was as much a practical arrangement as a personal bond. Families negotiated unions to strengthen alliances, expand land holdings, or ensure stability. However, Norse culture also allowed for a surprising degree of autonomy, especially for women. A woman could inherit property if she had no brothers, and once married, she often managed the household and its finances. If the marriage was not working, divorce was legally permitted, a right that could be exercised by either spouse. Women might return to their birth families with the property they had brought into the marriage. Such arrangements suggest a nuanced understanding of partnership, one that respected both personal agency and social structure. Children in Viking society were welcomed into a world of shared labor and learning. From a young age, boys and girls were taught the skills they would need: farming, weaving, carving, animal care, and oral traditions. Play was also part of childhood, with carved wooden toys, small boats, and animal figurines found in various excavations. Some toys even had wheels or movable parts, showing a creative flair. Games like Nuffatafal, a strategic board game, taught reasoning and patience. These early lessons, wrapped in play and observation, prepared children to take their place within the rhythm of Viking life. Education was not formal, but learning was constant. Through watching, listening, doing, wisdom was passed down not in books, but in conversation, in song, in example. Proverbs and riddles were especially valued as they tested cleverness and reinforced cultural norms. One preserved collection of Viking age wisdom, the Havamal, contains poetic sayings attributed to Odin himself. These verses, calm and thoughtful, advised listeners on friendship, generosity, caution, and the importance of honor. They remind us that even in an age shaped by storms and steel, reflection had its place, a quiet inner world shaped by observation and experience. Craftsmanship extended beyond textiles and tools. Wood carving, metalwork, and bone carving were all practiced with care and skill. Everyday objects, from spoons to sleds, carried a sense of beauty and usefulness. Viking artisans were known to inlay weapons with silver, shape intricate animal heads for ship prows, and carve ornate furniture from oak. These details suggest a world not only of necessity, but of aesthetic joy, a desire to make things well and to make them meaningful. Even grave goods reflect this mindset, as many buried items, though practical, were also finely made, suggesting a belief that craftsmanship carried value beyond life itself. All of this, the weaving, the carving, the passing down of names and knowledge, points to a society quietly rich in care and continuity. The Vikings did not see themselves as fleeting figures in time. They saw themselves as links in a chain, threads in a larger design, responsible for tending what came before and preparing what would come after. In the soft light of their homes, beneath layers of wool and linen, there existed a warmth, not only physical, but cultural, a sense that the world was made not just by warriors and kings, but by the many hands that spun, stirred, built, and sang. And so, as night drapes again across the northern sky, we sit gently with these quiet truths. The subtle grace of daily life, the soft clatter of looms and ladles, the strength of bonds not forged in fire, but in shared work, mutual respect, and the soft, enduring thread of family. Scattered across the Scandinavian countryside, weathered and time-worn, stand the runestones, tall, slender monuments, carved with winding letters and looping beasts. Some are tucked beside quiet roads or nestled near ancient farms. Others remain half hidden in mossy fields, their inscriptions faded by rain and wind, but each of them still whispers. These stones, placed upright by human hands 1,000 years ago, remain as eloquent traces of love, memory, and identity in the Viking world. While they cannot speak in the way people do, they carry messages across centuries, from one life to another. Runestones were not grand monuments to kings or gods alone. Many were raised by ordinary families in honor of someone loved and lost. Their inscriptions often begin with soft familiarity. Orstein raised this stone in memory of his father, or Astrid had this stone made for her son. The tone is simple, but the sentiment is profound. These were public declarations of affection, loyalty, and grief, a way of ensuring that a person's name would not vanish. To carve a runestone was to make memory physical, to root it in the land, so that travelers might pause, read, and remember. Some stones served legal or territorial functions, marking land claims or alliances. Others told of distant journeys, to the east with the Varangians, or westward to Vinland and beyond. Inscriptions might include prayers, curses, or riddles. And always, the runes twist and turn in long, curling patterns, often framed by serpents or ribbon-like creatures. The artistry is deliberate. The runestone was never just a text, it was a sculpture, an act of reverence, a collaboration between language and landscape. Even now, these stones seem to hold breath, as if listening for someone to read them aloud once more. Beyond the stones, The landscape itself bears the marks of the Viking presence. Burial mounds rise gently from grassy hillsides, each one a quiet world of its own. Inside, archaeologists have found not only human remains, but carefully chosen items, weapons, jewelry, animal bones, cooking tools, and sometimes even entire ships. These items were not buried haphazardly, they were placed with thought and symbolism. A sword for strength, a comb for dignity, a drinking horn for shared memory. To the Vikings, the grave was not only a resting place, but a threshold, and every object included was a part of that final journey. Ship burials are among the most striking of these resting places. The Gokstad and Oseberg ships, both excavated in Norway, are remarkably preserved and tell of people of great status, perhaps chieftains, priestesses, or powerful landowners. The ships were pulled ashore, placed in pits, and surrounded with grave goods. Then, carefully, they were covered with earth. These vessels, which had once carried their passengers across oceans, would now carry them into eternity. There is a certain softness in that image, the boat at rest, the sea stilled, the person cradled by the same structure that once bore their weight in life. And yet, for all the solemnity of burial, the Viking relationship with the landscape was not only about endings. It was also about continuity. The land was not just territory to conquer, it was a living partner. Trees were harvested carefully, fields rotated with understanding, and sacred groves preserved as places of peace and reflection. Some regions had particular trees or stones where offerings were made. Others maintained quiet glens used for lawmaking or seasonal rituals. In Iceland, the landscape became a kind of script, rivers and ridges shaping how stories were told, how power was shared, how history unfolded. Even the architecture of Norse settlements reflected a deep sense of place. Longhouses were built low and warm, using what the land provided: turf, timber, and stone. They were often oriented with the wind in mind, positioned to gather sun in winter and avoid chill in spring. Smoke holes in the roof let firelight rise into the night, while sleeping platforms lined the walls. These homes were not grand, but they were thoughtfully made. In Greenland and Iceland especially, settlers adapted quickly to new conditions, learning how to live with volcanic rock, freezing winds, and short growing seasons. Their resilience came not from brute force, but from careful observation and quiet adjustment. Paths wound through villages, not straight but curved, shaped by years of footsteps and practical need. Animals were kept nearby, not only for food, but for warmth and security. Storage houses stood slightly apart, raised on stilts to keep out moisture and pests. There was a rhythm to the arrangement, a logic born not from blueprints, but from generations of experience. Even today, the remains of Viking farms and halls follow these patterns, their outlines softened by time, but still legible to those who walk slowly and pay attention. And all around, the sea was never far. Even inland settlements were connected by rivers that led eventually to the coast. The Vikings measured distance not in miles, but in days of sailing or walking. Their world was scaled to experience, not abstraction. To them, the landscape was not separate from human life. It was its foundation, its mirror, its memory. A stone was not just a stone, but a witness. A hill was not just a rise in the earth, but a place where ancestors slept and stories began. As the mist rolls once more over the northern hills, and the ruins beneath lichen and moss fade gently into shadow, one can almost feel the quiet breath of the past. The soft imprint of a hand on a stone, the low hum of a name spoken into the wind, not as legend, but as life, real and lived, still echoing gently through the earth beneath our feet. While the longships and the legends often capture the imagination first, there is another side to Viking life that moved just as powerfully beneath the surface, quieter, slower, but no less remarkable. The Vikings were not only raiders and explorers, but traders and craftsmen. Their world pulsed with the rhythm of markets and meetings, of silver exchanged and stories shared, of goods that passed from hand to hand across seas and rivers, changing shape and meaning with each journey. In this way, the Norse wove themselves into the fabric of a vast and ancient network, one that stretched from the green shores of Ireland to the golden domes of Constantinople, and from the fjords of Norway to the distant bazaars of Baghdad. Trade was essential to Viking society, not only for wealth, but for connection. Their homelands, while rich in fish, timber, and iron, lacked many resources found farther south and east. Amber from the Baltic coast, furs from the northern forests, soapstone from inland quarries. All of these were bartered for silver, silk, spices, wine, and glass. The Vikings had a sharp eye for value, and their goods were often of high quality. They traded honey and beeswax, walrus ivory and falcons, and finely worked iron tools. Even slaves, a grim but undeniable part of the economy, were exchanged, taken in raids or bought and sold at distant markets. The currencies they used varied depending on the place and time. In the early Viking age, barter was common, but silver soon became the preferred medium of exchange. Rather than coins, many used silver by weight, rings, ingots, and chopped fragments of jewelry known as hacksilver. Traders often carried small scales to weigh silver with precision, and arm rings doubled as both adornment and currency. Coins from many lands have been found in Viking graves and hoards, Islamic dirhams, Byzantine solidi, Anglo-Saxon pennies, each bearing witness to far-reaching contact and cultural exchange. One of the most remarkable trading hubs of the Viking world was Hedeby, a bustling market town located near the southern edge of modern-day Denmark. Positioned between the North Sea and the Baltic, Hedeby became a nexus where cultures and goods converged. Archaeological excavations have revealed dense urban layers, workshops, docks, longhouses, and graves, along with thousands of artifacts from across Europe and beyond. Glass beads from the Middle East, silk from Asia, and carved combs from local artisans all mingled in its soil. Hedeby was alive with sound, the creak of cartwheels, the clink of metalwork, the murmur of half-understood languages. It was in many ways a world within a world, both Norse and international. Another key site was Birka, in Sweden, a thriving riverside market that flourished in the 9th and 10th centuries. Situated on Lake Mälaren, Birka connected inland trade routes to the Baltic and served as a cosmopolitan center for goods and ideas. Here, Christian missionaries from the Carolingian Empire arrived to spread their faith, while Norse traders brought back silk and wine from distant realms. Grave goods at Birka include elaborate clothing, foreign coins, and fine weapons, all signs of the wealth and diversity that flowed through its streets. Life in these towns may have been quieter than the sagas suggest, but it was no less full of movement and meaning. Trade also left subtle cultural fingerprints. In some Norse graves we find Islamic coins inscribed with verses from the Quran, not as religious symbols but as emblems of wealth and wonder. In others we see Eastern styles of sword-making or jewelry, their forms adapted and reinterpreted through local hands. This exchange was not only material but aesthetic, a mingling of design, of craft, of language and belief. In this way, the Vikings were not isolated. They were part of a larger living world, open to influence and eager to learn. Behind each traded object lies a hidden story, A glass bead, for instance, may have passed through 10 hands before arriving at its final resting place in a Norse grave, each hand leaving an unseen trace. A silk tunic, worn once and then stored for generations. A foreign coin repurposed as a pendant, worn by a child whose name we no longer know. These small details reveal the softer side of the Viking world, one not built on conquest, but on quiet curiosity. On a desire to touch, to see, to bring something home from far away, and fold it gently into daily life. And there is something soothing about this quieter current of the Viking Age, this vision of figures moving slowly through fog-bound harbors and market stalls, greeting familiar faces, trading small things that carry large meanings. A comb carved in a far-off village, a bolt of cloth dyed in shades only found in warmer lands. A silver brooch in the shape of a serpent. Each item was not just bought, but chosen, carried, wrapped, treasured, and eventually laid to rest beside someone who once held it with care. Even today, the remnants of Viking trade continue to surface in unexpected places. Coins in English fields, beads in Estonian graves, weights in Russian riverbeds. Their world was one of movement, of negotiation, of bridges between languages and lands. And always, it was shaped not just by what they brought back, but by what they left behind, the marks of a people who understood that even the smallest objects could carry the weight of memory. As the markets grow quiet, as lanterns are extinguished and voices fade into evening, this side of the Viking world endures, a world where trade was not only an act of commerce but a soft form of connection, echoing across distances great and small. In the Viking world, the divine was not distant. The gods were close, not gazing down from unreachable heavens, but walking alongside mortals, mingling in the fog of forests and the glow of firelight. They were storytellers and tricksters, warriors and weavers, guardians of fate and seekers of knowledge. Their stories were as much a part of Viking life as the tools on a belt or the stones of a hearth. And though much has faded with time, the echoes of their myths remain, soft as breath, but still alive beneath the surface of the northern world. At the center of it all stood Odin, one-eyed and ever-seeking. The god of wisdom, war, and poetry, Odin was no simple deity. He traded his eye for a sip from the well of knowledge, sacrificing vision for insight. He wandered the world in disguise, cloaked and hooded, gathering runes, songs, and secrets. His hall, Valhalla, awaited only those slain in battle, where warriors would feast and fight until the final days. Yet Odin was not just about strength. He was a god of questions, a patron of the curious, the cunning, the cautious, those who saw beyond the surface and sought meaning beneath. Then there was Thor, son of Odin and wielder of Mjolnir, a hammer that returned to his hand when thrown and crackled with thunder's force. Thor was a protector, a bringer of order amid chaos, defender of gods and humans alike. He rode through the sky in a chariot pulled by goats, and wherever his hammer struck, it drove back the giants who threatened the fragile balance of the world. Thor's appeal lay not only in his might, but in his steadfastness. He was a god of storms and strength, yes, but also of fertility, of harvest, and of the ordinary folk who called upon him for blessings in their daily toil. Freyja, too, held a central place in the Norse pantheon, goddess of love, beauty, sorcery, and death. Her presence was complex, multifaceted, and quietly powerful. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, wore a necklace of unmatched beauty, and chose half of the slain to dwell in her field, Folkvanga. Freyja was a practitioner of Scythe, the sacred magic that allowed glimpses into the hidden threads of fate. Through her we glimpse the softer side of the divine, one not of conquest, but of insight, desire and deep connection. She was often invoked in matters of the heart, of the home, of the unknowable paths ahead. And then came Loki, unpredictable, brilliant and dangerous. A shapeshifter and stirrer of trouble, Loki was the god of mischief and change. He fathered monstrous children, caused gods endless grief, yet also helped them through clever schemes. His tales are woven with contradiction. He both breaks and restores, betrays and aids. In many ways, Loki represents the forces in life that cannot be controlled, the twists of fate, the surprises, the accidents that remake everything. To fear him was wise, to understand him was wiser. The cosmos of the Norse was not simple. It was layered, interconnected, like the branches of the great tree Yggdrasil. At its top soared the eagle, at its base coiled the dragon Nithhog, gnawing at its roots. Between them lay 9 realms: Asgard, home of the gods, Midgard, the world of humans, and others like Vanaheim, Jotunheim and Hel. These realms were not distant heavens or hells, but part of a vast, living continuum. Gods and giants, elves and dwarves, spirits and shades all had their place. This cosmology shaped not just myth, but mindset. Life was not linear, it was cyclical, woven, braided like hair or rope. Time itself was understood differently. There was no eternal paradise. Even the gods would one day face Ragnarök, the twilight of all things. This final battle would bring fire and flood, the fall of gods and monsters alike. And yet, even in destruction, there was renewal. A new world would rise from the ashes, green and fresh, with life beginning again. In this myth of endings, there is also peace, a recognition that nothing is permanent, not even the stars, and that acceptance can be its own kind of courage. Religious practice among the Vikings was personal and local. There were no grand temples, no codified dogma. Worship took place in groves, at household altars, beside rivers and stones. Offerings of food, drink, or finely made objects were left as tokens of respect. Rituals were woven into daily life, a word whispered before setting sail, a carved rune for safe return, a shared cup raised in silent thanks. These gestures, small and sincere, shaped the Norse relationship with the divine, not through spectacle, but through intention. It was less about rules and more about rhythm, a way of being, a way of seeing the world with reverence. And as Christianity began to spread through the north, slowly at first and then with mounting momentum, these older ways did not disappear all at once. They blended, overlapped, resisted, and adapted. Crosses were carved beside Thor's hammer. Saints' names were spoken beside the old gods. Burial practices shifted gradually, and for a time both faiths lived side by side in quiet tension. It was not so much a battle as a transformation, slow and uneven, marked more by negotiation than conquest. In this merging of beliefs, a quiet resilience can be felt. The Norse worldview, with its reverence for nature, its trust in story, and its acceptance of fate, left lasting impressions. Even today, the days of our week remember the gods: Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Frasier. Their names live on, not just in stone or saga, but in the language we speak and the sky we watch. As twilight gathers and stars begin to pierce the cold sky once more, the gods of the north recede, not vanished, but resting remembered in the quiet pulse of old myths, waiting patiently in the folds of time. Among the most enduring legacies the Vikings left behind is one that we often carry unknowingly in the words we speak, the names we write, and the places we travel. The Norse tongue, like a quiet stream running beneath the surface of modern speech, has shaped languages across Northern Europe, especially in England and parts of Scotland, Ireland, and beyond. The soft murmur of Old Norse still echoes in countless everyday words and place names, subtle markers of lives once lived, of stories once told under a different sky. When Viking settlers reached the British Isles, they did more than raid and retreat. They stayed. They farmed, traded, raised families, and they named the land around them. Over time, their language mingled with Old English, forming a linguistic landscape that still bears their touch. Towns ending in by, such as Grimsby, Whitby, and Derby, come from the Old Norse word byr, meaning farm or village. Places ending in thorp, thwaite, or toft all trace their roots to Norse words for settlements, clearings, and homesteads. These names are quiet monuments, not carved in stone but etched into the very map. Even today, many common English words find their origins in Old Norse. Words like sky, egg, knife, window, and husband all come from Norse roots. The influence wasn't limited to nouns. Verbs such as take, give, and call also have Viking ancestry. The very pronouns they, them, and their emerged through Norse-English contact, replacing older Anglo-Saxon forms. These were not imposed but adopted gradually through everyday use, through conversation, negotiation, and coexistence. Language, like landscape, evolved quietly, shaped by shared experience more than conflict. One reason the Norse language integrated so smoothly into English was its structure. Old Norse and Old English were closely related Germanic languages, with many shared roots and similar grammatical forms. Norse-speaking settlers and Anglo-Saxon locals could often understand one another with minimal effort. Over time, the two tongues blended, smoothing their edges until they formed something new. In this way, language became not just a tool but a bridge, softening boundaries, forging kinship, and giving birth to new ways of expression. In Iceland, however, the Norse tongue remained largely intact. Old Norse evolved into modern Icelandic, a language that still preserves much of its ancient grammar and vocabulary. Icelanders today can read the medieval sagas in their original form with little difficulty, a rare continuity in the ever-shifting world of language. In a sense, Iceland became a living archive, cradling the voice of the past within its volcanic shores. This preservation offers a unique window into Viking thought, the poetry, humor, and subtlety of their speech, unchanged by time. The sagas, written down centuries after they were first spoken aloud, capture this voice with remarkable clarity. These narratives, often composed in prose with interwoven poetry, tell of voyages, vengeance, honor, and fate. Yet they are not merely heroic tales. They are filled with quiet observations, dry wit, and deeply human characters. A farmer worries over winter fodder. A child watches the horizon. A woman stitches a cloak, her thoughts drifting like snow. These moments, spoken in a language rich with texture, reveal the Vikings not as caricatures but as people, reflective, curious, and aware of the world's shifting moods. Runes, too, were a form of language, though written far less often and with far greater care. Each rune was both a letter and a symbol, imbued with meaning. The rune Fiu, for instance, stood for wealth, but also for the idea of movement and vitality. And Sus evoked communication, breath, and divine order. To inscribe runes was to choose with purpose, whether for a simple label, a solemn memorial, or a magical charm. The act itself was sacred. Stone or wood was cut slowly, patiently, with attention. In that silence between strokes, something lasting was born. What's more, the Vikings understood that language was not just a human tool, it had power. Words could bless or curse, heal or harm. In the sagas, a poorly chosen insult could spark a blood feud, while a well-timed verse could win honor or forgiveness. Names, especially, carried weight. A child's name might recall a grandfather, a hero, or a god. It might carry a wish for strength, peace, or wisdom. Naming was not random. It was a link in a chain, a thread from past to future. Even in the absence of writing, memory thrived. Oral tradition was the lifeblood of the Viking world. Poems were recited in complex meters, with alliteration and rhythm guiding the flow. The skalds, or poets, were trained to remember long passages and perform them flawlessly, a task requiring not only memory but skill in voice, posture, and timing. These performances were not stiff recitations, they were living acts, filled with subtle emotion and careful pacing, meant to move an audience both in mind and heart. And so when we speak today, when we say sky or knife, when we walk through towns ending in by or thorpe, we carry a small echo of those older voices. Not shouting but whispering, not commanding but reminding. The Vikings did not only leave behind ships and swords, they left behind syllables, cadence, a gentle undercurrent in the rivers of modern speech, a quiet inheritance, still heard when we pause long enough to listen. In the far north, where the sun lingers in the sky for days in summer and disappears almost entirely in winter, the passage of time feels different, not a strict calendar, but a long breath. For the Vikings, who lived in deep harmony with the changing seasons, nature was both provider and teacher. It was not separate from them, but a living presence, shifting, speaking, guiding. Their lives, though shaped by human hands and choices, were also paced by the slow rhythms of wind, frost, thaw, and bloom. In understanding their seasons, we come to understand their patience, their resilience, and their sense of quiet awe. The Viking year was broadly divided into two halves, summer and winter. There were no months as we think of them now, but rather markers set by changes in light and activity. Summer was a time of motion. Fields were worked, ships set sail, markets bustled, and alliances were made. People traveled to raid, to trade, or simply to visit kin. The world expanded during these months, full of action and color. Winter, in contrast, brought stillness. Snow blanketed the land, and daily life retreated indoors. Fires were tended, stories told, repairs made, and plans laid. The world narrowed, and reflection deepened. During the darker months, communal life took center stage. Longhouses became the heart of survival, not only for shelter, but for company. There is something profoundly human in this seasonal gathering, this drawing together of people under one roof, while the wind howls outside. It was a time for spinning, weaving, carving, and singing. Feasts marked midwinter, with traditions such as Jol, the Norse celebration of the winter solstice. This was a sacred time, filled with toasts, sacrifices, and the lighting of fires to welcome the return of the sun. Yule logs were burned, symbolizing the warmth and strength needed to carry through the darkest nights. These seasonal rituals gave shape to time. Without printed calendars or mechanical clocks, the Vikings relied on memory, observation, and collective knowledge. The sky told them what they needed to know. The stars moved differently each week. The sun's path shifted slowly along the horizon. The behavior of animals, the flowering of certain plants, and the freezing or thawing of water all offered signs. Time was not abstract. It was seen, heard, felt in the body. The year was not a number but a cycle, returning each time with familiar joys and fresh uncertainty. To navigate such a climate required skill and adaptability. Viking homes were insulated with turf, their roofs layered thickly to trap warmth. Hearths burned steadily, and smoke was allowed to linger slightly in the rafters, helping to kill pests and preserve meat. Clothing was layered, linen next to the skin, then wool, then furs. Boots were lined with hay or moss for insulation. Children learned early how to help gather fuel, feed animals, and make small repairs. Survival was a group effort, not dramatic, but steady, sustained through shared work and foresight. In spring, when the snows melted and rivers swelled, life returned quickly. Fields were plowed with simple tools drawn by oxen. Seeds were sown, barley, oats, rye, crops that could grow in short seasons. Sheep were sheared, calves were born, and preparations for sea journeys began. Ships were repaired, sails checked, supplies gathered. The hum of activity returned, not in a rush, but in a kind of awakening. And through it all, the land itself responded, greening, buzzing, opening once more to movement. The Vikings' relationship with the sea, too, was seasonal. Voyaging was done when the waters were calmest, from late spring through early autumn. Navigators relied on experience, landmarks, and even the behavior of seabirds. The sea could be generous, full of fish, roots and connections, or punishing. Storms could rise without warning, and ice could drift in from the north. Those who set out in ships did so with respect. They knew the sea did not belong to them. They were visitors upon it. In every season, the Vikings left offerings to ensure balance. Food was left for spirits, stones stacked in sacred spots, thanks given quietly with the turning of the wind. Their gods were not all-powerful overseers, but part of the cycle, bound by fate, by love, by their own flaws. The people lived with this same humility. They asked not for control, but for harmony. A safe voyage, a fair harvest, a fire that would last through the coldest night. And so the year turned, as it always did. From light to dark, from thaw to frost, and back again. Through these changing hours, the Vikings shaped a life not of domination, but of response, a listening life, a watching life. Theirs was a world of contrast, and within that contrast, they found balance. Silence and sound, cold and warmth, stillness and movement. Even now, if you walk the northern paths at dusk, you may feel it, that quiet presence. Not in ruins or relics, but in the pattern of things, a fence line shaped by wind, a trail smoothed by time, the softness of snow on an old roof. These are the seasons the Vikings knew, not just as weather, but as language, as rhythm, as story. In the quiet corners of Viking settlements, far from the noise of ships or song, there was the soft sound of labor, of hammers tapping against iron, of wood being planed smooth, of leather stretched and stitched into form. It was here, in workshops warmed by coals and lit by daylight filtering through smoke holes, that much of Viking life was made. Their tools, though simple by modern standards, reveal a world of careful attention, of time spent shaping, fixing, mending, and creating. And through these tools, we glimpse the heart of a culture that prized both function and form. Iron was one of the most essential materials of the Viking Age. It was used for everything from weapons and armor to farming implements and hinges. The process of extracting and refining it was labor-intensive. Iron ore, often gathered in the form of bog iron, was smelted in small clay furnaces called bloomery furnaces. The resulting metal was then hammered repeatedly to remove impurities. This was not a task done in haste. It took time, skill, and no small amount of heat. Blacksmiths were highly respected, for they could transform raw earth into something strong and lasting. A plow that could turn soil, a knife that could cut meat, a rivet that would hold a ship together through storm and spray. Carpenters, too, were vital to the fabric of Viking life. With simple axes and adzes, they shaped the timbers that formed homes, fences, wagons, and ships. The Viking longship in particular was a marvel of craftsmanship, light, flexible, and fast. Each plank was carefully shaped to fit against the next, held with iron rivets, and sealed with tar made from pine. The keel, the backbone of the ship, was carved from a single sturdy tree, often oak. This process, while complex, was performed with tools that fit easily in the hand, guided not by blueprints, but by generations of knowledge passed quietly from father to son, from master to apprentice. Leatherworkers turned animal hides into cloaks, belts, shoes, and water skins. They tanned skins using natural materials, bark, smoke, urine, and softened them by hand. Their work wasn't always beautiful, but it was essential. The harsh climate demanded strong footwear, reliable coverings, and containers that could endure the elements. Even the stitching had to be exact. The wrong thread or the wrong tension could cause a boot to fail on a long journey or in winter's cold. It's easy to overlook the quiet precision of such work, but in truth it was foundational. One well-made item could last for years, perhaps even be handed down. And there were those who worked in bone, horn, and antler, materials left behind after a meal, transformed into combs, pins, game pieces, and handles. These artisans carved intricate patterns into small, useful items. Some combs were so finely made that their teeth are still intact today, 1,000 years after they were used. The attention to detail is striking, not because it was required, but because it mattered. In these small touches, there was pride, care, and a belief that even everyday objects deserved beauty. Women's hands, too, shaped much of the Viking world. In addition to spinning, weaving, and sewing, women were often the managers of the household economy. They oversaw food production, storage, and distribution, deciding what to keep, what to trade, and what to prepare for winter. The keys to storerooms and pantries were not just practical tools, they were symbols of authority, often worn on a woman's clothing as a sign of her role within the home. A well-run household was a source of quiet power, and women held that responsibility with confidence and skill. In wealthier households, artisans might be specialists. In smaller farms and villages, tasks were shared. Everyone knew how to repair a fence, sharpen a blade, or make a simple bowl. This versatility was necessary in a world where resources were finite, and each season brought new demands. To waste was to risk survival. To build well was to ensure security. And so the Viking people, from smith to shepherd, shaped their tools and homes with patience and foresight, aware that the things they made today would become the anchors of tomorrow. Tools were not only practical, they were personal. A farmer might use the same axe his father once held. A child's first knife might be a hand-me-down, carefully dulled and wrapped for safety. A sailor's toolkit, carried from shore to shore, might include objects mended dozens of times, each repair a mark of use and care. These items, though small, carried stories. A notch in a handle, a patch on a bag, a worn spot on a blade. Each one a memory held in wood or iron. The Vikings did not mass-produce their world, they shaped it, bit by bit, in warm workshops and wind-swept yards, under the guidance of hands that knew the grain of wood, the weight of metal, the stretch of leather. They didn't build quickly, but they built well. And in doing so, They created not only things, but a way of life, slow, deliberate, lasting. Even now, when we unearth these tools, they speak in quiet ways. They remind us that civilization is not only measured in kings and battles, but in chisels and thread, in the quiet dignity of making, in the simple grace of a well-forged nail, a perfectly balanced hammer, a spindle that still turns. In the Viking world, justice did not come from palaces or marble halls, nor was it sealed behind closed doors. Instead, it unfolded beneath the open sky, spoken aloud on grassy plains, near ancient stones, or in natural amphitheaters where wind and voice could travel together. Their legal tradition, rooted in memory, custom, and shared responsibility, was one of the most remarkable features of Norse society. It was not just a tool of governance, but a reflection of values, a mirror held up to a people who believed deeply in fairness, reputation, and the quiet power of words spoken with care. The most important institution of Viking law was the Thing, an assembly of free men who gathered at regular intervals to discuss disputes, make decisions, and maintain the order of their community. These gatherings could range from local meetings in small settlements to grand national assemblies, such as the Althing of Iceland, which still endures today and is one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world. There was no single ruler who imposed the law from above. Instead, the law was remembered and spoken by a law speaker, an individual chosen for his knowledge, memory, and ability to recite legal codes aloud before the assembled crowd. Imagine the scene: a wide meadow, ringed by stones and soft hills. People arrive on foot or horseback, carrying food, goods, and stories. Some come to settle land disputes, others seek compensation for injury or theft. Some merely listen, bearing witness. The law speaker stands in the center, repeating lines passed down over generations, spoken in a cadence that helped preserve them across time. There are no written codes, not yet, only the living language of the law, repeated and refined through use. This process was deeply communal. Disputes were not resolved in private. They were aired before the community, where reputations mattered and fairness could be judged by all. Punishments were not focused on imprisonment, which was rare, but on compensation. If someone was harmed or wronged, a payment called wergild was expected. The amount varied depending on the crime and the status of the person involved. While this may seem unusual to modern ears, it offered a way to resolve conflicts without bloodshed, maintaining peace in a world where revenge could easily spiral into endless feuding. Still, not every wrong could be paid for. In cases of severe violence or repeated offenses, an individual might be declared utlag, an outlaw, no longer protected by the law. This was a serious sentence. It meant the person could be killed without consequence and was denied the safety of society. Yet even here, the system left room for choice and redemption. Some outlaws fled and found new lands. Others returned after years and negotiated their way back into the fold. The system was flexible, built on consensus and compromise more than rigid enforcement. Women also had a place within this legal world. While they could not always participate directly in every assembly, they had rights and protections under the law. They could inherit property, request divorce, and in some cases defend themselves or speak on behalf of others. The sagas tell of women who used legal knowledge to protect their families, recover stolen goods, or challenge injustice. Though Viking society was far from egalitarian by modern standards, it allowed a surprising degree of agency, particularly in comparison to contemporary societies elsewhere in medieval Europe. The Thing was not only about conflict, it was also a place of gathering, of seasonal rhythm. Markets were held alongside the assemblies, songs were sung, alliances forged, and marriages arranged. It was a social event as much as a legal one, a place where news traveled, where ideas spread, where people remembered who they were and who they belonged to. In this way, law was not a separate force, but part of daily life, woven into the seasons, shaped by custom and care. Over time, as Christianity took hold and kings consolidated power, the structure of Viking law began to shift. Written codes were introduced, and royal authority began to play a larger role. But even then, the memory of the thing remained strong. In Iceland, Norway, and elsewhere, it survived, reshaped, but not forgotten. It remained a symbol of collective governance, of community built not by decree, but by dialogue. To sit at a Viking assembly was to take part in something deeply human, a tradition of listening, speaking, agreeing, disagreeing, and moving forward together. It was not perfect, but it was thoughtful. It asked for participation. It invited memory. It demanded presence. There were no microphones, no documents, no judges in robes, only people weathered by seasons, gathered in circles to decide what was fair. And perhaps there is something to learn from that still. That justice can be spoken in plain air. That resolution can be found not only in punishment, but in understanding that the voice of the community, when heard with respect and patience, can shape a world that lasts. As the gathering ends and footsteps scatter through the grass once more, the words linger, not written on paper, but carried in minds and memories. Soft echoes, returning home with the people who heard them. In the grand sweep of Viking history, the voyages, the battles, the markets and myths, it's easy to overlook the softest lives of all the children. Yet within the walls of longhouses and the meadows of homesteads, Viking childhood unfolded with its own rhythm, a blend of freedom and responsibility, wonder and watchfulness. Though the sagas speak mostly of adults, the traces left behind tell us that children were ever present, shaping and shaped by the world they would one day inherit. From the moment they were born, Viking children were wrapped in layers of care and custom. Birth was not simply a biological event, it was a spiritual passage. A child's arrival was often marked with naming rituals, offerings to household spirits, and the careful selection of a name that carried meaning. Names might honor ancestors, invoke strength, or reflect qualities hoped for in the new life. Some children were given names based on dreams, signs, or even the time of year they arrived. These choices were not made lightly. A name was more than a label. It was a thread connecting the child to the web of family, fate, and community. Infancy was tender but fragile. Life in the Viking world could be harsh, and infant mortality was high. Mothers, often surrounded by female relatives or midwives, did what they could with the knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Breastfeeding was common, and children were weaned gradually, often staying close to their mothers for several years. Swaddling was used in early life, and cradles lined with wool or moss offered warmth. Wooden toys, carved animals, and small figurines suggest that even the youngest among them were not forgotten. Not only fed and clothed, but entertained and comforted. As children grew, so too did their role within the household. Viking society did not separate childhood from labor in the way we often do today. Children learned by doing, not through formal schooling, but through watching, imitating, and participating. A young girl might sit beside her mother, learning to spin or prepare food. A boy might follow his father into the field, fetching tools or tending animals. Tasks were given gradually, increasing in responsibility with each passing year. By adolescence, most children were already skilled contributors to their home's survival, not as burdens, but as part of the family's strength. And yet there was space for play. Archaeological finds across the Norse world reveal simple joys: game boards for Hanafatafal, a Viking strategy game not unlike chess, toy ships and carved animals, marbles made from polished stones. Some objects seem to be whistles or noisemakers, perhaps used in play or ritual. Children likely ran barefoot through the grass in summer, splashed in streams, and played at mimicry, pretending to be warriors, traders, or storytellers. Their games, like their work, prepared them for the adult world, teaching coordination, strategy, strength, and speech. Fosterage was another important element of Viking childhood. It was common for children to be sent to live with other families, often relatives or trusted allies. This was not done out of neglect, but as a means of strengthening bonds between households. A fostered child might learn new skills, build relationships, and grow under the guidance of another respected adult. These arrangements could be temporary or long-term, and they served both practical and political purposes. The bond between foster parent and child was deeply respected, often held in equal esteem to blood ties. Discipline, when needed, was likely enforced through community norms and family expectations rather than formal punishment. Honor and shame were powerful tools. A child who disobeyed might be reprimanded, but also reminded of their place within the larger story: a name to uphold, a house to represent, a lineage to continue. Obedience was taught not only through fear, but through pride and belonging. Stories of ancestors, tales of gods and heroes, all provided examples of bravery, wisdom, and self-restraint. These narratives were not just entertainment, they were instruction, and as children approached adulthood, often around the age of 12 or 14, they stepped slowly into new roles. Boys might train with weapons, learning to handle axes, shields, or bows. Girls might take on greater household responsibilities, learning the finer skills of weaving, cooking, or managing servants. But these lines were not absolute. Some girls learned to fight, while some boys became scolds or craftsmen. The expectations were guided more by necessity and skill than by rigid categories. Coming-of-age rituals varied, but certain milestones were quietly marked. A first hunt, a first voyage, a first public speech. There is little evidence of elaborate ceremonies, but much of symbolic transition. A boy who carried a sword, a girl who received a set of keys. These were quiet thresholds, not shouted across, but stepped over in the presence of those who noticed. In death, Viking children were mourned with deep tenderness. Burials of young people often include favorite toys, small beads, or protective charms. These graves remind us that even in a time often romanticized for its violence, there was profound love, a wish to provide comfort, even in the unknown. Some children were buried alongside adults, perhaps mothers or foster parents, their bones entwined in sleep. Others rested alone, in small graves marked with care, placed where the morning sun might find them. To think of Viking children is to remember that history is not only made by kings or warriors, but by those who learned slowly, loved deeply, and played quietly in fields long since grown over. Their lives, though short or silent in the sagas, mattered. They were held, named, guided, and missed. Their laughter once echoed through the same halls that now lie still beneath the soil. Even now, when the wind passes through the tall grass of an old Norse homestead, you might imagine it. The soft footfalls of children running home, the distant hum of a lullaby once sung beneath the stars. For the Vikings, the sea was more than a path. It was a pulse, a constant presence at the edge of vision, a voice that whispered both promise and peril. It shaped their homes, their tools, their stories. even their sense of the sacred. The sea was always there, vast and dark and unknowable, and yet they came to know it in ways that still feel extraordinary. Their relationship with water was not marked by dominance, but by intimacy. They were not masters of the ocean, but listeners to its rhythm, students of its mood, and passengers within its breath. From the earliest days of childhood, Norse people learned to read the sea's many languages, the texture of its surface, the shape of its waves, the color of its foam, a change in wind direction, a sudden silence among birds, a shift in the scent of salt. All of these could foretell a storm or guide a ship toward land. These were not superstitions, but careful observations, passed through generations and honed through experience. There were no charts or compasses, but there was memory. Landmarks memorized like verses, currents known by feel, clouds interpreted like maps. The longship was the Vikings' greatest tool for unlocking the sea. Sleek and symmetrical, it was both functional and beautiful, able to cut through open waters and glide into shallow rivers. Its design was flexible, able to reverse without turning, and fast, powered by both oars and sail. The sail, made of wool and often dyed in rich colors, was both practical and symbolic. It could be raised in a matter of moments and lowered just as quickly. The ship itself was often carved with a figurehead, a dragon or serpent, not merely for decoration, but as protection, meant to ward off spirits or frighten enemies. Longships varied in size. Some were built for 30 rowers, others for twice that. And they were not just for raiding. They were used for trade, exploration, migration, and ceremony. Entire families might set sail together, seeking better lands or escaping conflict. And always the ship was central, not just a vehicle, but a symbol of passage, of destiny, of identity. To own a ship was to hold power, to die with one was to carry dignity into the next world. Sea voyages were not always smooth, and Viking sailors knew the risks. Sudden storms, hidden reefs, drifting ice, these were constant threats. Supplies were carefully packed, dried fish, hard bread, casks of water and ale, extra woolen cloaks. Navigation relied on skill, on luck, and on the ability to adapt. Some voyages lasted days, others weeks. Some reached distant shores, others returned with only stories or silence. But each journey added to a growing web of memory, a mental map of coastlines, islands, and winds, drawn not in ink but in thought. Even across great distances, Viking seafarers found their way home. They used the angle of the sun, the habits of seabirds, and the temperature of the water. Some scholars believe they may have used sunstones, translucent crystals that help locate the sun's position even on cloudy days. Whether or not this tool was widespread, the concept speaks to a broader truth, that the Norse did not fear complexity. They worked with it, shaped it, trusted it. Along the way, the sea itself became sacred. Islands were sometimes treated as ritual spaces, where offerings might be left on a quiet beach or in a hidden cave. Some sailors carried small idols or talismans for protection, carved figures of Thor, beads strung with amber or bone. The ocean, like the gods, was both generous and fickle. It could deliver riches or take them away. It could bring you to a new land or swallow your ship without warning. To sail was to enter into a pact, an understanding of balance and humility. In poetry, the sea was given many names: whale road, seal's plain, gull's mirror. These kennings, or poetic metaphors, reveal a way of seeing that was deeply relational. The sea was not just a setting, but a character, alive, responsive, and watching. Skalds spoke of it with reverence and awe, embedding it into their verses like a recurring breath. For the Viking imagination, the ocean was not a barrier, but a bridge, not an absence, but a presence. Even in death, the sea remained. Some were buried in ships, as we've seen, while others were laid to rest beside the shore, within sight of waves they had once traveled. To be near the sea, even in stillness, was to remain connected to the vast and endless cycle of movement. It was not departure, but continuation. And now, when we look upon the coastlines of the north, the fjords of Norway, the black sands of Iceland, the green cliffs of the Scottish Isles, we can still feel it. That quiet pull. The sense of a people who once stood at the edge of the world, looking out not with fear, but with calm readiness. For in their bones, the sea was not just water, it was rhythm, it was memory, it was home. In the Norse world, belief was not bound in books or written creeds. It was not spoken from pulpits or sealed by solemn proclamations. Instead, it lived in the rhythms of nature, the pulse of seasons, and the quiet daily rituals of those who listened closely to the land. Viking spirituality was not an abstract theology, but a woven fabric, thick with gods and ghosts, ancestors and animals, stone circles and sacred groves. It shifted with the tide and flickered like firelight. To live for the Vikings was to live inside a cosmos filled with presence, seen and unseen. The gods they honored were many, and they were far from perfect. Odin, wise and brooding, wandered the earth in disguise, always searching, always trading one truth for another. Thor thundered across the skies in his goat-drawn chariot, wielding Mjolnir, not only to crush giants, but to bless crops and marriages. Freya, bold and radiant, ruled over fertility and fate, her tears falling as gold. And Loki, the trickster, tangled their stories with cleverness and chaos alike. These gods did not dwell far above the world. They moved through it, walked within it, flawed and mysterious, as close as the weather, but Norse faith extended beyond these divine figures. It was deeply animistic. Spirits were thought to reside in rocks, rivers, animals, and trees. Some homes kept carved wooden figures of household deities, small protectors of hearth and kin. Others paid quiet homage to land spirits with offerings of bread or ale. Ancestors, too, were never far. Their memory lingered in burial mounds, their names passed to children, their presence honored at feasts and family gatherings. To be forgotten was a fate worse than death, but to be remembered, truly remembered, was to live again in the speech of the living. Rituals were often simple, personal, and tied to place. At sacred groves, people might gather to offer thanks. At solstices and equinoxes, fires were lit and mead was poured. The blot, a sacrificial feast, could range from a small family gathering to a community-wide ceremony. Animals were offered, their blood thought to carry power, not in cruelty, but in reverent exchange. A portion of food might be buried for the land, a ship might be launched with prayers sewn into its sail. There was no priestly class as such, though certain individuals, especially women, served as seers, mediums, or keepers of sacred knowledge. They read the threads of fate and listened for what the world might be trying to say. But over the course of the Viking Age, a new current began to flow northward. It came slowly at first, through trade, through captured monks, through whispered prayers in unfamiliar tongues. Christianity, with its single God and sacred book, entered the Norse world not with fire and conquest, but with quiet curiosity. Some Vikings encountered it in distant lands, when raiding monasteries or sailing up foreign rivers. Others met it at court, in the presence of kings who sought alliances with Christian realms. It was not just a matter of faith, it was a matter of politics, power, and practicality. At first, the two belief systems coexisted. In some graves, archaeologists have found both crosses and Thor's hammers. Some warriors wore both, not out of confusion, but out of caution. Why not honor both gods, if each might offer protection? Old stories were reinterpreted, new ones were woven in. As more Norse rulers converted, often to strengthen political ties, they encouraged, or at times compelled, their people to do the same. Churches were built where sacred groves once stood. Wells dedicated to Thor were rededicated to saints. Slowly, the face of the spiritual world began to change. Yet conversion was not uniform, nor was it swift. In some places, it happened through formal decree. In others, it was gradual, almost imperceptible. The Icelandic story is particularly gentle. In the year 1000, a decision was made at the National Assembly, the Althing, to adopt Christianity as the official religion. But the old ways could still be practiced in private, at least for a time. It was a compromise, born not of conquest, but of consensus. There would be no civil war over belief, no burning of neighbors. The gods of the past would step quietly into memory. Even as Christianity took deeper root, the shadows of the older faith never vanished entirely. Traditions persisted in rural areas, seasonal rituals, folk charms, midsummer fires, carved wooden guardians above the door. The structure of Norse myth, with its 9 worlds and central tree, faded from daily speech, but endured in folk tales and place names. The rhythm of the year, Yule in winter, gatherings at harvest, aligned comfortably with the Christian calendar, repurposed rather than erased. The early Christian faith in the North was shaped by this inheritance. Saints took on the roles once played by gods. Holy wells replaced sacred springs. The fear of trolls became tales of devils. The whisper of land spirits softened into angelic visitations. Even the architecture bore the mark of the old world. In some churches, Viking carvings survive in beams and portals, dragons twined beside apostles. The two traditions were not so much enemies as overlapping layers, with the old folded gently beneath the new. And perhaps that is the most telling truth of all. That belief, like water, finds its own shape. It flows through culture, through story, through need. The Vikings did not abandon their gods overnight. They reshaped them, reimagined them, folded them into new stories. Their deepest faith was not in a name, but in something older, the sense that the world was alive, that it spoke in symbols and seasons, and that life itself was a thread to be woven with care. Today we can still hear that thread, in place names, in midsummer bonfires, in the quiet dignity of rituals carried down through centuries. The Norse gods have long since passed from the temples of the living, but they remain in the earth, in the tales, and in the way the people of the North once walked through the world, listening, honoring, and always attuned to the sacred that waits just beneath the surface of things. To understand the Vikings, one must first understand their sea, not just as a body of water, but as a presence. Cold and endless, the sea was a companion, a boundary, a mirror. It was memory and myth and muscle. It sang beneath their wooden hulls and whispered through the fjords where their longships slept. For the Norse people, the sea was never separate from daily life. It was in their food, their stories, their rituals, and even their dreams. They lived by it, feared it, honored it, and followed it into the unknown. From the moment they were old enough to walk, children learned to sense the ocean's mood. They watched the skies for subtle changes, listened for the hush that came before wind, and studied how gulls danced above distant shoals. These were not lessons taught in schools, but passed on through repetition, through time spent hauling nets, patching sails, and feeling the cold slap of salt spray against skin. Knowledge was tactile, not theoretical. To know the sea was to feel it in the soles of your feet and the knots in your rope. And central to this life on water was the longship, perhaps the most iconic of all Viking achievements. Long, narrow, and perfectly balanced, these vessels were made for both speed and flexibility. Their shallow drafts allowed them to navigate not only open ocean, but shallow rivers and tidal estuaries. They could land on almost any shore, launch in minutes, and retreat just as swiftly. Every plank was shaped by hand, the keel carved from a single sturdy tree. The hull flexed gently with the waves, absorbing shock. A large square sail, often dyed deep red or striped, caught the wind like a living wing. These ships were not merely transport. They were living symbols of identity, prestige, and purpose. A man's ship said as much about him as his sword or his lineage. Some ships were adorned with carved figureheads, dragons or serpents, sharp-toothed and staring, designed to frighten spirits or enemies alike. Others bore more modest touches, a spiral carved into the tiller, a bronze nail pounded in for luck. The ship was an extension of the self. To leave shore without one was to leave part of your soul behind. Voyages were planned with the seasons. The sea, though ever present, had its moods. Generous in summer, treacherous in winter, crews waited for the right moment, watching winds, tides, and stars. Navigation was a matter of experience and quiet memory. The sun's position, the patterns of swells, the flight paths of birds, all offered signs. Some believed the Vikings used sunstones, translucent crystals that polarized light, to locate the sun even on cloudy days. Whether true or not, their ability to cross thousands of miles without compasses or charts remains a feat of quiet brilliance. They sailed west to the British Isles and Ireland, south to Francia and Iberia, and east through rivers that led deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine. Along these waters, they traded, raided, and settled. They brought home silk and spices, stories and silver, impressions of other ways of life. And sometimes they didn't come home at all. The sea kept many secrets. Shipwrecks lost to sudden storms, sailors vanished beneath crashing waves. No matter how skilled, the ocean reminded them always of its power. Yet even in its danger, it held beauty. It was where gods were said to walk, where sea serpents curled beneath the surface, and where the dead might find passage to another world. In Norse belief, the ocean was not just physical, it was part of the mythic landscape. The world itself was thought to be ringed by a vast serpent, Jörmungandr, who slept in the sea and would one day rise to signal the world's end. And in daily life, offerings were sometimes made to the waves, small tokens thrown overboard, prayers whispered to the wind, a carved bone slipped into a pouch for protection. Burial practices also reflected the sea's centrality. Some of the most elaborate Viking burials were ship burials, graves in which the deceased was laid to rest inside a vessel, surrounded by personal items, weapons, animals, and goods for the journey beyond. The ship might be set aflame and pushed out to sea, or more commonly, buried in the earth beneath a mound. It was not only the wealthy or powerful who received such honors. Smaller boat graves have been found for women and children too, gestures of care, of belief that the sea would carry them home. Even those who were buried inland often faced the sea, their stone markers aligned with the distant horizon. It was a way of keeping the ocean near, a reminder that it was always calling, always moving, always waiting just beyond the edge of known land. Songs and poems spoke of it with reverence and caution. The sea had many names in Norse poetry: Whale Road, Seal's Plain, waves hoarse. These poetic expressions, called kennings, transformed the ordinary into the sacred, layering the familiar with metaphor and myth. In every element of Viking life, the sea echoed. It shaped how they built, how they moved, how they imagined the world. Their legends began on its shores, and their memories often ended there. A longship disappearing into morning mist, a figure watching from the cliffs, a name carved into driftwood. Today, in the fjords of Norway, the black sands of Iceland, and the quiet harbors of old trading towns, that connection remains. The ocean is still there, shifting, silent, infinite. And though the longships are gone, their lines remain in the stories we tell and the maps we follow. Not loud, but steady. Not bold, but enduring. For the Vikings, the sea was not just a place they visited. It was a presence they carried with them, in their bones, in their dreams, in the very rhythm of their breath. To the Vikings, death was not a silence, but a crossing. It was a journey that began at the end of breath and continued into another realm, not as a fading away, but as a movement onward. The way they buried their dead reveals as much about their hopes and fears as it does about their daily lives. These burials, varied and symbolic, speak of a people who believed in memory, in preparation, and in the quiet presence of the unseen. Every grave was a doorway, gently propped open with care. Viking burials came in many forms. Some were grand, full ship burials beneath great mounds of earth, packed with weapons, treasures, food and animals. Others were more modest, simple graves dug into the earth, the body wrapped in a cloak or laid upon a wooden board, surrounded by a few carefully chosen items. The form varied by region, by era, by status, but the spirit was the same. The dead were not cast aside or forgotten. They were seen off with intention. The ship burial remains the most iconic. In places like Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, archaeologists have uncovered ships laid to rest on land, mounded over with soil and stone, preserved by time and clay. In these ships, the dead were positioned with care, surrounded by goods that reflected who they were and what they might need beyond this life. A queen or noblewoman might be buried with tapestries, carved sleds, chests of clothing, and tools of weaving. A warrior might be laid beside his sword, his shield, his drinking horn, and his horses. Each object was a piece of a story, a final chapter told in silence and soil. Not every ship was full-sized. Some graves used smaller boats, symbolic in nature, meant to carry the soul across the waters of the next world. Others shaped stones in the outline of ships, tracing their edges on the earth, evoking movement even in stillness. These graves lined the coastlines and ridges, often facing the sea. It's thought they were placed to overlook old sailing routes, to keep the dead connected to the rhythms they knew in life, the call of waves, the shimmer of stars on black water. Grave goods were deeply personal. They reflected gender roles, professions and beliefs. Farmers were buried with tools, traders with scales and weights, children with toys, beads, and carved animals. Women might have brooches, weaving implements, or household keys. Men might have knives, hammers, or game boards. Sometimes the items included were broken, deliberately snapped or bent, perhaps to symbolically release their spirit, or to ensure the dead would not return in anger. The inclusion of animals was common too. Horses, dogs, even birds, loyal companions and guides for the journey ahead. The Norse believed that the soul had layers. One part might linger near the home, another journey to the halls of the gods. The most well-known destination was Valhalla, Odin's hall, where warriors chosen in death would feast and fight until the end of days. But this was not the only afterlife. Freyja received her own share of the fallen, welcoming them into Folkvang, a realm of peace. Others went to Hell, the realm ruled by the goddess of the same name. Hell was not a place of torment, as later beliefs might suggest, but a shadowed, restful place, a land of the quiet dead, not the damned. The process of dying, too, was not taken lightly. In some sagas, we read of people choosing the manner of their death, climbing into burial mounds, fasting, or speaking final verses to prepare their souls. There was honor in dying well, in facing death with calm, and in being remembered rightly. The memory of a person, their name, their deeds, their words, was seen as enduring far beyond the body. As long as someone spoke your name, you were not truly gone. Runestones served this purpose. Many were carved not only to mark graves, but to preserve legacies. Gunvor carved this stone in memory of her husband. Eric raised this stone for his brother, who died in the east. These inscriptions, often paired with swirling beasts or ribboned runes, were messages to time. They carried the voices of those left behind, voices that wanted the world to know someone lived here, someone was loved. In burial mounds, archaeologists have found traces of food, loaves of bread, meat, fruit. These were meant not for ritual, but for sustenance. A journey, after all, required provisions. Some graves included drinking horns, filled at the time with mead or ale. The dead were to be nourished, comforted, and accompanied. Even musical instruments, such as lyres or horns, appear in some burials, as if the dead would sing or listen as they traveled. And in the quiet of these graves, we find not sorrow, but continuity. The Norse did not believe that death ended everything. They believed it reshaped the path. The soul moved onward, maybe to another hall, maybe to another world, maybe into the cycles of fate itself. There was no single dogma, no clear map, but a shared sense that life did not vanish. It transformed. Even today, to stand before a Viking grave is to feel something of that presence. The mound softened by moss, the stones sun-warmed, the sea not far. You can imagine the funeral procession, torches in the dusk, a chant rising over the hills, the silence as earth begins to fall. It is not eerie, but peaceful, not dark, but enduring. The Vikings gave their dead what they could: memory, protection, and time. They shaped the earth in their honor. And through these graves, they speak still, in quiet language, in lasting form, in the hush of wind, through grass that grows where names once rang aloud. In the long evenings of the north, when the wind pressed softly against the wooden walls of the longhouse and the fire burned low in the hearth, a voice would rise, calm, practiced, and resonant. It filled the space with stories older than memory, stories carried not on parchment, but in people. The skalds, the poets of the Viking world, were not mere entertainers. They were keepers of time, sculptors of language, and guardians of the deeds that shaped their world. Through their verses, the Vikings remembered who they were, who they loved, and what they feared. In their words, even silence had rhythm. Poetry in the Viking Age was not a solitary craft. It was public, performative, and vital. The skald stood or sat among others, beside the hearth, before a lord, at a feast or a funeral, and recited verses composed with intricate care. These poems were not free-form, but bound tightly by rules, alliteration, rhythm, and complex metaphor. Each line was shaped like a crafted sword, balanced, deliberate, strong. The forms varied, but the most intricate was Drottvat, a courtly meter with internal rhyme, and repeated patterns, like waves returning again and again to shore. To speak in such a way required more than memory. It required training. Skalds learned the names of gods, the structure of sagas, the poetic devices called kennings, metaphorical phrases that replaced ordinary words with something richer. The sea might be called the whale road, a sword might be a wound hoe, gold could become Freyja's tears. These weren't riddles for the sake of complexity. They were echoes of myth, references hidden like threads in a tapestry. Each phrase summoned not just an image, but a world. The subjects of skaldic poetry were wide and varied. Some poems were praises for kings and jarls, careful celebrations of victories, generosity and wisdom. A well-spoken poem could earn great reward. A poorly crafted one might be met with silence or scorn. Other verses honored the dead, telling their stories so that others might remember. A warrior's courage, a mother's wisdom, a traveler's fate, all became verses to be passed along like heirlooms. Some poems offered wisdom, like the Havamal, the words of the High One, attributed to Odin himself, filled with advice on hospitality, caution, friendship, and the fleeting nature of life. But poetry was not only for the elite. In villages and farms, during long winters and quiet meals, stories were shared aloud. The sagas that were later written down, the saga of Eagle, the saga of the Greenlanders, the tales of Gudrid and Leif, all began as spoken word. They changed with each telling, refined not by editing, but by performance. The people remembered, corrected, and added. They lived inside the story, and the story lived through them. This oral tradition was the lifeblood of Norse culture. Without books or widespread literacy, memory was everything. A name spoken was a name remembered. A deed told was a deed preserved. In a world shaped by reputation, to be remembered well was one of the highest honors. And so the skalds did not only record history, they created it. They framed events, added weight to moments, and gave shape to the past. Some poems were composed in the moment, quick verses spoken in response to events. A man might compose a lausa visa, a short stanza, after a duel or during a storm. Others were long, structured compositions prepared for court or feast. The act of composing was both mental and musical. Each line had to fit within the rules, while also carrying emotion, narrative, and nuance. It was a test of intellect and artistry, performed aloud, often before watchful eyes. And skalds were not only men. Though fewer women are named in the sources, they too composed, performed, and preserved. The role of memory keeper, a voice in the longhouse, belonged to those who had the gift and the courage to speak. In some cases, it was women who remembered sagas for generations, passing them to their children, carrying the past within lullabies and laments. Even after the arrival of Christianity, the tradition endured. Many early Christian poets used skaldic forms to praise saints or recount miracles. The rhythms of the old world remained, simply turned toward new subjects. In Iceland especially, where oral tradition flourished longer than in most places, the sagas were eventually written down in the 13th and 14th centuries. Thanks to the care of scribes and the memory of storytellers, these records survive, not as relics, but as living stories, still read today in nearly the same language that first gave them voice. To hear a skald speak was to feel history move, not in textbooks or timelines, but in breath, in sound, in the way a room falls silent when the right words are spoken. Poetry made the past present. It made names into echoes. It stitched memory into rhythm. And now, centuries later, When we read the lines they left behind, or walk the hills where their words once rang out, we join that listening. We lean toward the fire. We hear the hush that comes just before the tale begins. In the stillness of Norse longhouses, amid the scent of baked bread and the low clatter of weaving tools, women moved with quiet authority. Their presence was not always heralded in song or saga, but it was deeply felt in the pulse of the home, in the careful management of land, in the threads they spun and the lives they shaped. The image of the Viking warrior dominates much of modern imagination, but to understand the depth of this world, we must look also to the women, to their roles, their rights, their rituals, and the spaces they carved within a society, both rugged and reverent. Viking women were not invisible, nor were they confined solely to domestic life. Though they lived within a patriarchal society, they held a degree of freedom, property rights, and personal agency that was remarkable for the early medieval world. A woman could own land, manage estates, and inherit wealth, especially if she was widowed or had no brothers. She could represent herself in legal matters, and in some cases demand divorce if the marriage no longer served her needs. These freedoms were not granted lightly. They were woven into the legal and cultural structure of Norse society, preserved in law codes and saga stories alike. The household, in many ways, was a domain of quiet power. A Viking home was more than a shelter. It was an economic and spiritual center. Women managed its rhythm. They organized food stores, oversaw textile production, maintained relationships with neighbors and kin, and ensured that everything, from livestock to harvest to hearth, remained in balance. The key, often worn at the woman's waist, was both a tool and a symbol. It granted her access and authority. To hold the key was to hold the rhythm of the household. Weaving, spinning, and dyeing were not only domestic tasks but vital forms of production. Cloth was wealth. Ships required sails, and sails required acres of woven wool. A single ship sail might take hundreds of hours to create, cleaning the wool, spinning the thread, dyeing it with lichen or bark, and weaving it tightly enough to catch the wind. Women provided these essentials. In sagas and grave goods alike, the tools of textile work appear with reverence: iron shears, stone spindle whorls, loom weights, and distaffs. The act of making cloth was seen as sacred, tied to the myths of the Norse, the goddesses who spun and cut the threads of fate. Some women also traveled. There are accounts of women accompanying men on voyages abroad, not only as settlers but as traders. On farms in Iceland and Greenland, women adapted quickly to harsh conditions, managing resources and guiding households in their husbands' long absences. In the east, in what the Norse called Garthariki, the lands of the Slavic and Rus peoples, Norse women have been found buried beside trade routes, their graves marked by a blend of local and Scandinavian custom, suggesting they were not just visitors, but participants in far-reaching exchange. Then there are the enigmatic graves, burials that challenge expectation. The famous Birka grave in Sweden, long thought to belong to a male warrior, was revealed through DNA analysis to be a woman. Buried with weapons, gaming pieces, and war horses, she was likely a person of strategy and high rank. While debate continues about the interpretation, such discoveries invite us to reconsider the full spectrum of female identity in the Viking Age, not only as mothers or wives, but as leaders, explorers, and perhaps even warriors. And beyond all of this, some women held ritual roles. The Velva, the seeress or wise woman, appears often in sagas and archaeological finds. She wore cloaks of rich fabric, brooches and beads, and carried staffs believed to channel magic. These women practiced Sather, a form of Norse magic or prophecy that involved trance, chanting, and the bending of fate. The Velva stood at the boundary between the living and the otherworldly. Feared, revered, and sometimes ostracized, she was a conduit between what was known and what lay beyond. In one grave, a woman was buried with a staff tipped with iron, a symbol of her role. Around her were herbs, amulets, and animal bones. It was not the burial of an ordinary person. It was the resting place of someone who had walked the invisible paths. Marriage, too, was shaped with care. It was not only a personal union, but a contract between families. Dowries were negotiated, not only in coin or livestock, but in promises and protections. Yet within these arrangements, women had agency. If mistreated or abandoned, a woman could divorce her husband and reclaim her dowry. Some sagas even describe women initiating divorce by publicly declaring their intent before witnesses, often at the family's threshold. There was dignity in such a choice, a quiet power to step away from what no longer served. Women's voices, though less often preserved, echo through the sagas. They speak sharp truths, offer wisdom, demand vengeance, mourn their dead. They are bold and poetic, strong and clear. In some tales, it is the woman who propels the plot, who calls for action, who holds the legacy of the family on her shoulders. They are not accessories to male stories, they are their own axis. Today, when we uncover a brooch from a grave, a spindle weight in a forgotten field, or a carved comb from a buried box, we are holding more than an object. We are holding the echo of hands that shaped a world. Viking women were makers, thinkers, organizers, guardians, and storytellers. Their presence may not always roar, but it does not vanish. It endures in fiber and thread, in name and lore, in the gentle strength that once held homes together and walked quietly beside the roar of wind and sea. To understand how the Vikings lived, it helps to picture not a battlefield or a voyage, but a quiet settlement tucked into the folds of a green valley or along a misty coastline. A place where smoke rises gently from sod roofs, where animals shift in fenced pastures, and where long, narrow buildings stretch low against the landscape. These were not places of grandeur or glitter. They were places of comfort, built to endure, shaped with wisdom. In their homes, the Vikings revealed another side of themselves, one that prized warmth, rhythm, and the gentle weight of routine. The typical Viking home was the longhouse, a rectangular structure made of timber, stone, or turf, depending on what the landscape provided. In forested areas, wooden planks or logs formed the walls. In places like Iceland or Greenland, where trees were scarce, turf was cut from the ground and layered over stone foundations, creating thick, insulating walls that held warmth through the long winters. The roof, steep and heavy, was often covered in grass, not for appearance, but for insulation and stability. When you see these homes from a distance, they seem to rise naturally from the earth, as though the land itself had shaped them. Inside, the space was open, simple, and shared. A central hearth provided heat and light, its smoke rising slowly through a vent in the roof or through gaps in the beams. On either side of the hearth ran long benches, sometimes lined with furs or straw, where people sat, slept, worked, and ate. Life unfolded here communally. Children played near the fire, elders offered stories or instruction, women wove and spun, and meals were prepared in large iron cauldrons suspended over the flame. There were no rooms in the modern sense. Privacy was found not behind doors, but in quiet corners or in the subtle language of space and custom. Light was precious. Windows, if present, were small and often covered in animal bladder or translucent horn. During the dark seasons, the glow of fire was supplemented with oil lamps or candles made from tallow or beeswax. The flicker of light cast dancing shadows across the timber walls, illuminating carvings, tools, and the faces of those gathered around the warmth. It was a soft world, full of muted textures, wood grain, woolen cloth, the sheen of polished bone or iron. The longhouse was more than a residence. It was a symbol of order and stability. Its layout reflected a sense of purpose. At one end, animals might be housed, sheep, cattle, or horses, providing warmth and security. At the other end, storage rooms or sleeping areas. Sometimes, a separate structure held tools, surplus food, or trade goods. The larger the home, the higher the status of the household. But even modest homes showed careful planning, thresholds aligned to the wind, stones laid to direct water away from the foundation, beams chosen for their strength and shape. Around the home, the settlement grew in concentric rings of activity. Small outbuildings, fences, and paths connected barns to workshops, pastures to fields. Smokehouses preserved meat, sheds sheltered carts and tools, wells or nearby springs provided fresh water. And always the natural world was close. Trees leaned in at the edge of the farm. Birds nested in the roof thatch. The seasons moved across the walls, whispering changes in light and temperature. In towns and trading centers, homes were built closer together. Streets were narrow and often muddy. Wooden planks might be laid down as walkways. Drainage ditches and storage pits showed an awareness of hygiene and need. In places like Hedeby and Rib, houses were clustered beside markets, workshops and docks, creating a hum of human motion. These were not sprawling cities, but dense, living networks, each home a node in a web of trade, kinship and craft. Even the construction process held meaning. Raising a longhouse was a communal act. Neighbors helped neighbors. Timber was carried and carved, joints notched and fitted without nails. The roof was lifted beam by beam. When finished, a feast might mark the event. Stories speak of symbolic objects placed beneath the threshold, bones, coins, or talismans, to bless the home and bind it to the land. These gestures remind us that building was not only physical but spiritual. Despite their durability, few Viking homes survive today. Wood decays, turf returns to the soil, but their shapes remain in archaeological outlines, in reconstructed farms, in the echoes left behind in sagas and soil. And through these shapes, we see not only shelter but philosophy. The Vikings did not build to conquer the land, but to live with it. Their homes breathed with the seasons. They leaned into the wind. They endured not through force, but through harmony. To imagine life in a Viking home is to imagine warmth more than spectacle. A bowl of stew shared at dusk. A story told by firelight. The soft brushing of wool on skin. The quiet sound of someone rising early to tend the animals. These were the rhythms that defined a world, not the clang of swords, but the beating of daily time. A life built slowly with care. A life lived closely with others. And in this way, the Vikings remind us that home is not just a structure, it is a practice, a gathering of breath and purpose, a shelter for both body and spirit, a place where memory nestles into the beams, and even silence feels like something held. Beneath the thatched roofs of longhouses, in quiet corners near the hearth, the heart of Viking life simmered gently in clay pots and iron cauldrons. Theirs was not a world of abundance, but of balance, a world where every meal was tied to the land, the season, and the skill of those who prepared it. Food was more than nourishment. It was rhythm, it was ritual, it was the taste of survival wrapped in warmth and scent. The Viking diet, though shaped by necessity, was both varied and resourceful. They raised livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and their farms produced milk, butter, and cheese in addition to meat. They grew grains like barley, rye, and oats, which became the base for bread, porridge, and ale. In colder regions where grain harvests were short, these staples were carefully stretched and stored, sometimes mixed with seeds, nuts, or ground bark in leaner times. Bread was often flat, cooked on hot stones or over the fire, its texture coarse, its flavor earthy, shaped more by endurance than indulgence. Fishing, too, played a central role, especially along coasts and rivers. Herring, cod, and salmon were salted, dried, or smoked to last through winter. In Iceland and Greenland, where farming was limited, dried fish became a cornerstone of daily meals. In wealthier households, shellfish and seabirds might also appear on the table. Inland, freshwater fish were caught in woven traps or nets made from twisted fibers. These were not lavish spreads, but carefully planned portions: a slice of dried fish, a bowl of warm porridge, a piece of buttered bread, passed from hand to hand. Hunting and gathering supplemented the basics. In forests and hills, families gathered berries, mushrooms, hazelnuts, and herbs. Wild game, deer, boar, hare, was hunted with bows, spears, and dogs. Honey, when available, was a treasured sweetener used to flavor mead or preserved fruits. Some settlements even kept hives, their buzzing occupants offering both wax and sweetness in a world where sugar did not exist. Cooking was centered around the hearth, and nearly every meal was shaped by fire. Iron cauldrons hung from hooks or chains, gently rocking over the flames as stews bubbled with onions, cabbage, and meat. Flatbread was toasted on stones or griddles, and in some cases, ovens made of clay or stone were used for baking. Smoke infused everything: clothing, walls, and meals alike, giving Viking food its characteristic warmth. Clay pots and wooden bowls, carved spoons and knives with bone handles, were everyday tools shaped for both function and beauty. Seasonal feasts brought variety and celebration. During midwinter, the festival of Yule offered roasted meats, strong ale, and carefully prepared dishes made with what had been stored, smoked, or salted. Celebrations often included toasts, raised in honor of the gods, ancestors, and the coming sun. Drinking horns passed from hand to hand, and the warm flicker of firelight made even the darkest months feel communal. These feasts were more than indulgence, they were renewal. A moment to pause, to remember, to look forward. Ale and mead were the most common beverages, brewed from grain and honey respectively. Water was, of course, essential, though sometimes less trusted near settlements due to contamination. Fermented drinks were safer and more satisfying, often brewed in small batches at home. Drinking vessels were crafted from horn, wood, or pottery, and carved with patterns or names. To drink together was to affirm kinship. To offer a drink was to welcome. To toast was to honor. Food preparation was largely overseen by women, who also managed preservation. They salted fish, smoked meats, churned butter, and dried herbs. They used pits, cellars, or jars buried in cool earth to keep perishables from spoiling. Everything was used, nothing wasted. Bones were boiled for broth. Fat was rendered into tallow. Grains were ground slowly between stones. It was a life of steady motion, guided by the quiet ticking of hunger and season. Even in distant journeys, food traveled with the Vikings. Ships carried dried fish, hard bread, ale in barrels, and sometimes cheese wrapped in cloth. On raids or trade voyages, meals were plain but practical. At night, sailors gathered around fire pits on land, warming their hands and stomachs before returning to the sea. Food was not only survival, it was comfort, a reminder of home carried in every bite. Archaeological discoveries reveal much of this forgotten culinary world. Charred grain stuck to ancient ovens, animal bones arranged with care, clay vessels containing traces of herbs or mead. In some graves, a person was buried with food, a final meal for the journey ahead. In others, tools of the kitchen, a ladle, a pot, a carving knife wrapped in cloth. These remnants remind us that eating was not only essential, it was meaningful. A daily act that connected the body to the land, the family to the season, the living to the remembered. And so in the quiet comfort of their kitchens and fields, the Vikings created more than meals. They created continuity, a rhythm of sustenance that tied their world together, from fjord to forest, from longhouse to market. Their food was not grand, but it was grounding. A bowl of hot soup, a slice of dark bread, a cup of ale beneath the stars. Even now that warmth lingers, not just in recipes, but in the gentle way they honored each meal as part of the whole. In the hands that stirred, in the fire that fed, in the hush that came with the first bite on a cold, still night. It's easy to imagine the Vikings as isolated, fierce figures from the misty edges of Europe, wrapped in wool and leather, far from the crossroads of history. But this, like so many images, is only a shadow of the truth. In quiet, astonishing ways, the Vikings were among the most connected people of their time. Their ships did not only sail westward toward England or Iceland. They flowed along great river systems into the heart of Eurasia, followed coastlines down to the Byzantine Empire, and passed through winding straits into unfamiliar lands. The Norse world, though rooted in the north, extended far through trade, travel, and silent influence. At the heart of this reach were the rivers. In the east, Viking traders known as the Rus moved steadily inland along the Dnieper and Volga, steering their ships through narrow bends, lifting them over land when needed, and joining a network that connected the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. They passed through dense forests and wide plains, eventually reaching great cities like Novgorod, Kiev, and beyond, places that grew in part from the contact and commerce they brought. At Constantinople, or Miklagardha, as the Vikings called it, they encountered something vast and dazzling. Marble streets, golden domes, towering walls, and markets full of silks, spices, and incense. Here, some Norsemen joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguards. Loyal, tall, and fierce, they stood out in the crowded capital. But they were not only warriors, they were observers, guests in a world so different from their own. They brought home stories of this shining city by the Bosporus, its rituals, its riches, and its strange, beautiful ways. Viking merchants were sharp-eyed and adaptive. They traded amber from the Baltic coast, walrus ivory from Greenland, furs from the deep northern forests, and finely wrought swords from Scandinavian forges. In return, they acquired glass beads, silk, wine, coins, and finely worked jewelry. The coins especially reveal much. Buried in hoards across Scandinavia are thousands of silver dirhams minted in Islamic lands, each one carried, counted, and valued far from the place of its creation. To find such a coin in a Viking grave is to trace the outline of a world far wider than expected. These networks weren't only about goods, they carried ideas, languages, and practices. Norse people encountered Christianity, Islam, and Orthodox traditions, along with unfamiliar technologies and customs. Some of these took root, others drifted back to sea. In a Viking settlement in northern Scotland, you might find a brooch in a Slavic style. In a grave in Sweden, a man buried with a Persian coin. The quiet mixing of cultures happened not through speeches or treaties, but through barter, through marriage, through long, patient seasons of living side by side. Viking markets were full of this motion. In places like Hedeby, Cowpalm, Birka, and Dublin, traders gathered beside rivers and harbors. There were wooden booths, open stalls, goods laid out on cloth. Language filled the air: Norse, Saxon, Slavic, Arabic. Scales and weights ensured fairness, and silver was often weighed by hand. Trade was not only external. Within the Norse world, towns exchanged timber, wool, iron, and grain. A woman from a farm in Denmark might wear beads traded from Baghdad. A man fishing in Greenland might drink from a cup made in the Rhineland. And yet, for all this connection, the Vikings remained rooted in their own traditions. Their homes, their clothing, their laws, all retained the patterns of the North. They were not absorbed into other cultures. They adapted without vanishing. In some places, like Normandy, they became lords. In others, like Iceland, they remained farmers and poets. Always, they carried a sense of self, shaped by the land, the sea, and the memory of stories passed from mouth to mouth. One of the most haunting remnants of Viking trade is not a coin or a weapon, but a bead. A single glass bead, found in a Scandinavian grave, traced by researchers to a workshop in the Middle East, carried thousands of miles, touched by hands from at least 2 continents, worn perhaps by someone who never saw where it came from, but who felt its value, its beauty, its story. In such a small object lives a wide world. Today we speak of globalization as something modern, but the seeds were there centuries ago in the quiet voyages of Norse traders, not only in what they took or sold, but in what they saw. The world they moved through was vast, and they met it not with fear, but with curiosity. They listened, they bartered, they learned. So when we think of the Vikings, it is not only right to see them aboard their ships, eyes on the horizon. It is also fitting to imagine them standing in foreign marketplaces, wrapped in cloaks, silver at their belts, surrounded by spices, silk, and strange voices. Travelers not just in distance, but in understanding. Beers of memory, makers of quiet bridges between distant lives. And in the hush of that marketplace, beneath the rising sun, the past feels near, not loud, not grand, but deeply, enduringly connected. Among the most delicate traces the Vikings left behind are their runes, those slender, angular letters carved into stone, wood, and bone. To look upon them now is to see not just a writing system, but a kind of language that lived in the fingertips. It hummed softly with memory and meaning, passed not through ink and parchment, but through the slow scoring of a blade across a surface. For the Vikings, runes were more than letters. They were symbols of power, of intention, and of connection, linking the seen with the unseen, the speaker with the silence beyond. The runic alphabet used during the Viking Age is known as the Younger Futhark, named after its first 6 characters, Njers I Njers Si, Njers Si. With only 16 letters, it was compact but adaptable. Each rune held a phonetic sound, but also a layered meaning. The rune Fihu, for instance, represented the Fiv sound, but also wealth, cattle, and abundance. Tuaz, shaped like an upward arrow, stood for the god Tyr and the ideas of justice, sacrifice, and order. In this way, runes were never only read, they were felt. Carving runes was an act of care. They were not casually scribbled, but etched deliberately into door frames, sword hilts, combs, amulets, and grave markers. Some inscriptions were simple, names of owners, blessings for protection, short prayers. Others were longer, poetic messages or dedications to the dead. On rune stones, these texts often spiraled or flowed along the edges, accompanied by intricate animals or braided patterns. They were meant to endure, not just for years but for generations. One of the most remarkable things about runes is their tone. Many inscriptions are not grand or boastful, but intimate. Tormod carved these runes. Gunhild raised this stone for her brother. May Thor bless this ship and its crew. These are messages of love, memory, hope. They are the ancient equivalents of a note tucked into a sleeve, a name etched on a tree, a whisper caught in wood grain, quiet and lasting. And yet, runes were not only practical, they carried a magical weight. In Norse myth, it was Odin who first gained the runes, not through inheritance but through sacrifice. He hung from the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, seeking knowledge in silence and pain. When he finally grasped the runes, he did not just learn a script, he learned the bones of the world. Each rune could shape reality, when used with care. To speak a rune, to carve it with intention, was to stir the threads of fate. Some runes were believed to heal, others were thought to protect in battle or ensure a safe voyage. Charms were carved into wooden staves and worn on the body. In some grave sites, small rune-marked sticks or tablets have been found, their purpose unclear, but their presence unmistakably deliberate. The blend of language and mystery was part of their magic. Runes were not used for everything. They were reserved for what mattered, and they weren't only carved in death or defense. They were part of daily life, etched into the handles of tools, marked on weights and measures, even doodled on walls and doorposts. In Bergen, Norway, hundreds of runic inscriptions have been discovered, on wooden sticks, birch bark, and pieces of bone. Some are messages between lovers. Others are jokes, notes, or instructions. One reads simply, "Think of me, I think of you. Love me, I love you." Another adds a quiet bit of humor. "This stick says too little." Through these small messages, the Vikings come alive, not as myths, but as people, clever, tender, longing to be remembered. Runes were also used in games, in riddles, and in divination. A person might cast rune stones and read how they fell, interpreting their positions as signs from the gods. Though this practice is more obscure in the historical record, echoes of it remain in later folk traditions. What mattered was not the mechanics, but the mindset that words held weight, that shapes carved with focus could touch what lay beyond ordinary speech. Over time, as Christianity spread and Latin script replaced the runes, their presence began to fade from daily use. But they were never entirely forgotten. In isolated regions, runes continued to be carved into tools, memorials, and personal belongings. Even as new languages and beliefs took hold, the old letters lingered, like footprints in frozen earth. Today they survive in museums, etched into stone and wood, waiting patiently for eyes to trace their lines once more. And in them, we find not just language, but presence. Someone's hand once held a knife. Someone leaned close to the grain. Someone whispered a name, shaped it into a rune, and left it behind, not for fame, but for remembrance. And so the runes still speak, not in volume, but in depth, not in command, but in continuity. They are the breath of a past that never truly vanished, the shape of a thought held steady, etched carefully into the curve of time. The Viking Age, for all its drama and motion, did not end with a single event. There was no final battle where swords were sheathed for the last time, no declaration that scattered the longships or silenced the gods. Instead, the age passed as twilight does, not with a bang, but in slow layers of fading light. One by one, the familiar shapes changed. A chieftain pledged loyalty to a king. A wooden hof gave way to a stone church. A rune carver took up a Latin script. And all across the north, the rhythm shifted, gently but unrelentingly, toward a new kind of world. By the middle of the 11th century, the transformation was well underway. The last great Viking expedition to England, led by King Harald Hardrada of Norway, ended in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The loss was not just a military one, it marked the symbolic end of an era when Norse rulers looked outward to expand by sea. That same year, William of Normandy, himself descended from Viking settlers, invaded England from the south. The conquest that succeeded was not carried out by longships and raiders, but by knights, alliances, and centralized authority. The age of the Viking warband was giving way to the age of feudal monarchs. Yet the people of the north did not disappear. They remained in their fjords and farmlands, in their towns and settlements, continuing to live as they always had, slowly adjusting, quietly adapting. The sea was still fished, fields were still plowed, families still gathered in the warmth of longhouses, even as their timber beams were eventually replaced by stone. The outer world changed, but the inner life, the rhythm of the seasons, the importance of kinship, the quiet trust in memory and custom, endured. One of the most profound shifts came in the form of religion. By the 11th century, Christianity had spread throughout most of Scandinavia. It was not always a peaceful conversion. In some regions, pagan temples were destroyed and old rituals outlawed. In others, the change was more gradual, a cross carved beside a Thor's hammer, a saint's day layered atop a seasonal feast, a Christian blessing whispered alongside a familiar charm. The sacred did not vanish. It changed shape. Where once people honored gods in groves and at hearths, they now entered churches, carrying with them echoes of an older reverence. The political landscape changed as well. Kings consolidated power, turning fragmented chiefdoms into centralized realms. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, royal dynasties began to formalize authority, creating law codes, issuing coinage, and aligning more closely with continental Europe. The old thing, the communal assembly of free men, persisted, but was slowly absorbed into new institutions of monarchy and state. What had once been a world of many voices gradually narrowed into fewer, stronger ones. Governance became more vertical, authority more official. Trade, too, evolved. The routes established by Viking merchants remained, but they now flowed through growing towns and under the control of monarchs and guilds. Markets became more regulated, currency more standardized. Goods were still exchanged, wool and fish, timber and furs, but the character of trade had changed. It was less personal, more institutional. The long-distance journeys that once defined the Viking Age were replaced by more fixed networks, governed by treaties, taxes and tolls. The merchant replaced the raider, the scribe replaced the skald, and yet the memory of the age lingered. In Iceland, the sagas were finally written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, centuries after the Viking Age had technically ended. But those stories, long preserved in oral tradition, retained the flavor of a different time. They spoke of ancestors who lived close to the land, who spoke with gods, who made decisions not by decree, but by gathering and consensus. They captured not just battles and voyages, but domestic life, the weaving of cloth, the baking of bread, the quiet tension of a winter night. These stories became the lens through which the Viking Age was remembered, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. In language too, the past persisted. Norse words found their way into English, especially in regions once settled by Norsemen. Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, parts of Scotland and Ireland, place names still whisper their origins. A by marks a village, a thwaite notes a clearing. And in everyday words, sky, window, egg, knife, husband, the Viking voice continues to speak. The built environment slowly changed. Wooden homes gave way to stone. Pagan burial mounds faded into grassy hills. Churches, with their towers and bells, rose above villages where once only smoke curled from low thatched roofs. But even in these new buildings, the old designs remained. The layout of farms, the placement of hearths, the careful alignment with wind and sun, all echoed an older understanding of space and season. Perhaps most enduring was the mindset, a deep, practical reverence for the land, for community, for story. The Viking Age did not end with silence. It ended with transformation. Its spirit carried forward into the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms, into the settlement of Greenland, into the Icelandic manuscripts and folk traditions that continued to pass from one firelit room to another. Today, the legacy lives not only in museums or reconstructions, but in the quiet persistence of northern culture, in the simplicity of a woven cloth, in the resilience of a windswept farm, in the patience of those who still listen to the land and sea. The Vikings are not only remembered in swords and stones, they are remembered in rhythm, in the shape of words, in the pace of life. The Viking Age did not vanish. It settled into the soil, into memory, into story, and like so many stories, it waits not to be revived in clamor, but to be listened to in stillness. As the age of the Vikings receded into the soft dusk of time, it left behind something more lasting than iron or stone. It left behind stories, not just tales of war or glory, but slow, rich tapestries of human life. Sagas carried first in voice and then in ink, shaped by memory, sharpened by silence, and cradled by generations who understood that to remember was to honor. These stories, known today as the Icelandic sagas, form one of the most remarkable literary legacies of the medieval world. They whisper not only what the Vikings did, but how they thought, how they felt, and how they wanted to be remembered. The sagas were not written during the Viking Age itself, but centuries later, most between the 12th and 14th centuries, long after Scandinavia had become Christian, after kingdoms had formed and old gods had faded into shadow. Yet the people of Iceland, far from the courts of Europe and untouched by conquest, preserved the old tales. These stories had been told aloud for generations, in longhouses during winter, in quiet moments between work, at feasts where memory was poured out alongside ale. They were shaped not by a single author, but by communities of listeners and tellers, refining and repeating until the words felt like stone smoothed by river water. When finally written, the sagas were recorded in Old Norse, in a language still close to that spoken in the Viking Age. They were penned with care onto calfskin parchment, each letter traced with ink, each chapter arranged like beads on a thread. The scribes, many of them monks or scholars, did not only preserve history, they preserved atmosphere, the cadence of the spoken word, the pauses, the space between sentences where breath once lived. What makes the sagas so unique is their tone. They are not heroic epics in the classical style. They are quiet, understated, often full of long silences, indirect emotions, and a sense of fate winding quietly in the background. A character may speak only a single line before making a life-altering choice. A feud may unfold over dozens of years, sparked by an insult as small as a missed greeting or an unreturned gift. And yet within that sparseness lies profound depth. We feel the weight of land, kinship, duty, and time. We come to know these people not as caricatures, but as deeply real, flawed, thoughtful, bound by their world and by one another. Some sagas recount great voyages. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red tell of journeys across the sea to lands far west, to Greenland, and even to Vinland, a mysterious place many now link to North America. Others, like Eagle's Saga or Njol's Saga, stay closer to home, unfolding in the farms and valleys of Iceland, tracing the tangled paths of families across generations. There are tales of love and vengeance, of prophecy and exile, of children who grow to avenge their parents, and of friends who stand together until the end. But not all sagas are grand in scope. Some are brief, almost fragmentary. They preserve a single moment, a poetic stanza, a clever trick, a haunting death. These smaller sagas are like embers, glowing quietly, asking only to be noticed. And woven through all of them is the same sense of balance, between humor and sorrow, between fate and free will, between the world as it was and the world as it was remembered. The sagas are not entirely historical, nor entirely fictional. They exist in a space between part folklore, part family record, part meditation. Archaeology has confirmed many of their details, the layout of homes, the tools described, even the names of people long buried. But the sagas are not meant to be fact checks. They are meant to feel true, to capture the essence of a time, the temperature of a culture, the sound of breath in cold air. And through them, the past remains close. We can still hear the voice of a farmer reflecting on the death of his wife, the voice of a child asking about the meaning of a dream, the voice of a woman standing alone at her threshold, speaking into the dark, knowing that her words may change the shape of everything that follows. These voices are not ghosts. They are guides, showing us a world that valued restraint, endurance, and the soft strength of those who carried memory like fire in their hands. Even today, the sagas are read aloud in Iceland, studied in universities, adapted into novels, television, and poetry. Their influence lingers, not because of spectacle, but because of something deeper, a clarity of vision, a steadiness of tone, a sense that life, in all its quiet complexity, is worth remembering. And perhaps that is what the sagas teach best. That memory is not always loud. That history is not only made by kings. That a well-told story, full of space and shadow and feeling, can last longer than any sword, longer than any monument, longer even than the language in which it was first spoken. The sagas remain, softly, enduringly, waiting only to be listened to again. And now, as we near the quiet close of this long and winding voyage, we return not to ships or swords, but to something softer, to the lingering breath of a people whose lives, though centuries behind us, still reach forward in echoes and fragments. The Vikings are often remembered in shouts, in conquest, fire and steel, but perhaps they are best remembered in the silences, in the curve of a rune carved by hand, in the hush of snow across a burial mound, in the worn stone of a threshold where a name was once spoken, again and again, until it faded into the wood smoke. Their legacy is not a single thing. It is not just the raids or the battles, the explorers or the kings. It is a mosaic, each piece small, each story one thread in a larger tapestry. Some were warriors, others were weavers, some traveled far, others never left their valleys. Some told stories, others became them. They were not a single people with one identity, but a diverse, evolving world of farmers, traders, poets, sailors, mothers, children, and elders who watched the stars and knew the sea by heart. What they left behind is everywhere and nowhere. A scrap of wool preserved in ice, a comb carved from antler, a sagging stone wall now cloaked in moss that once marked the edge of a farm. Words passed down, still spoken, still heard. A lullaby sung in a language we barely understand. Their gifts were quiet ones, systems of law that honored consensus, myths that explored the strange shape of fate, buildings designed with the seasons in mind, and a sense of belonging not only to place, but to time. Even their gods, now silent, still linger in the language of days. Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Freya. These names slip past us as we plan and schedule, rarely stopping to wonder whose footsteps we are echoing. But they are there, gently embedded, reminders that the Vikings never truly disappeared. They simply changed shape, like smoke, like tide, like memory. The Vikings did not record their lives in stone temples or palaces. They built in wood, in turf, in things that fade. They lived close to the earth, listening to its cycles, shaping their lives around the long darks and short days, the thaw and the harvest. Their wealth was not in gold, but in kinship, story, and survival. To know them is not to know grand monuments. It is to know rhythm, of work, of weather, of waking to tend animals, of falling asleep to the crackle of fire and the hush of wind against the roof. They believed in fate, not as doom, but as thread, something woven, tangled, often unknown, something we each walk, whether in war or peace, in joy or silence. And in this belief, there is a kind of comfort, a sense that life is part of a larger pattern, that even the smallest life, a shepherd in the hills, a weaver in a smoky room, is held within the same cloth as kings and gods. Their world was not perfect. There was violence, there was hardship, there was slavery and sorrow and struggle, but there was also grace, in the way they spoke of honor, in the way they mourned their dead, in the way they raised stones to remember each other. Thorstein raised this stone for his brother. Astrid made this for the one she loved. These are not declarations of empire, they are offerings of memory, and this may be their greatest gift, not in what they conquered, but in what they kept alive, the power of remembering. The belief that stories matter, that the dead are not lost when we speak of them, that the sea, the sky, the soil beneath our feet are not merely backdrop, but part of who we are. Today, across Scandinavia, in quiet places where the land still folds the way it did 1,000 years ago, the past hums beneath the surface. A farmhouse stands where another once stood. A path winds through trees that have seen generations pass. In Iceland, the sagas are still read. In Norway, the coastline still shapes the villages. In Sweden, the runestones still mark the fields, and all across the world, in people descended from those ancient journeys, in England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Ukraine, Canada, the thread continues, not loudly, not always seen, but there, if you ever stand beside the sea and feel something stir, something deeper than wind, perhaps you are hearing it. If you sit by a fire and think of those who came before, of those whose names you do not know, but whose lives made your own possible, perhaps you are remembering in the Viking way, not with ceremony, but with stillness. And when you speak a word that once passed through their lips, sky, law, dream, gift, you carry a small piece of them with you. The breath of the north, the hush of frost, the beat of oars on dark water. The Vikings are gone, but not lost. They remain, in echoes, in rhythm, in you.